The island was already burning, and the war had barely touched it yet. From the air, Peleliu looked small, broken, and unremarkable. A strip of coral and jungle surrounded by shallow blue water. No cities, no civilians to liberate, no grand prize that looked worth the cost. And yet, in the autumn of 1944, this island would consume men at a rate that stunned even those hardened by years of war. Peleliu was supposed to be quick. 3 days, secure the airfield, move on. That was the plan. What followed was one of the most brutal, misunderstood, and relentlessly violent battles of the entire Pacific War, a fight where terrain itself became a weapon, where heat crushed endurance, and where survival often came down to whether the rock around you held when the next explosion hit. The landing began under a sun that offered no mercy. War temperatures soared. Water ran low almost immediately. The coral ground reflected heat upward, turning the air into a furnace. As American forces came ashore, resistance appeared light, almost deceptive. But Peleliu was no longer defended the way previous islands had been. The enemy did not rush the beaches, they waited. They had learned. Instead of defending the shoreline, Japanese forces withdrew into the island's interior, into caves, tunnels, and fortified ridges carved deep into limestone. Positions were invisible until they opened fire. When they were hit, they vanished underground, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. Nowhere was this more evident than the Umurbrogol Ridge. Soon known as Bloody Nose Ridge, it was not a single hill, but a maze of jagged rock, caves, and narrow defiles, where every advance was exposed and every position overlapped with another. Progress was measured in yards. Losses were measured in platoons. This was not a battle of movement. It was a battle of erosion. Men fought uphill in blistering heat. Flamethrowers and grenades became necessities. Its sleep vanished. Water became more precious than ammunition. Every night brought infiltration. Every day brought counterfire from positions that seemed impossible to silence. Units rotated not because objectives were complete, but because they were shattered. The psychological toll was as heavy as the physical one. There was no clear front, no safe rear area, no moment where the island felt under control. Casualties mounted so quickly that replacement units were fed directly into the same killing ground. Marines and soldiers fought knowing the island's strategic value was already being questioned, but the fighting could not simply stop. Too much had already been paid. Peleliu exposed a truth many did not want to confront, that even late in the war, with victory approaching, battles could still demand everything, without offering clarity in return. The island was eventually secured. The airfield was taken. The enemy was neutralized. But the cost was staggering. Entire units were reduced to fractions. The ground was scarred beyond recognition, and for many who survived, Peleliu never truly ended. The Battle of Peleliu matters because it strips war of narrative comfort. It shows what happens when doctrine meets adaptation, when expectations collide with reality, when men are committed to ground that offers no mercy and no escape. It stands as a warning that not all battles fit clean explanations, and that some victories are paid for long after the fighting stops. Tonight, we return to that island, to the heat and the stone, to the ridges that swallowed entire companies, to Peleliu, one of the bloodiest island battles of the Second World War. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment and hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time is it for you there? Is this a late-night listen, an early morning start, or a quiet moment carved out of a busy day? And if these long, steady journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or simply stay present with stories that deserve time, I hope you'll consider subscribing. Every subscription helps keep this kind of calm, in-depth storytelling alive. Stories told without rush, without noise, and with respect for the people who lived them. If this feels like a place you'd like to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the history of the Battle of Peleliu, July 19th, 1944. Inside a sweltering planning room at Pearl Harbor, a United States Navy commander circles a tiny speck on a Pacific map with his grease pencil. The island measures barely 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, roughly the size of Manhattan's Central Park. Its name is Peleliu, and according to the intelligence summary sitting on the table, capturing it will take no more than 4 days. The commander draws a confident line through the estimated timeline and writes 3 days maximum in the margin. In exactly 58 days, that same officer will stare at casualty reports showing nearly 2,000 Americans dead, and the battle still raging with no end in sight. But on this humid afternoon in Hawaii, with maps spread across every surface, and victory seeming inevitable across the Pacific, Peleliu looks like nothing more than another quick stepping stone toward Tokyo. The confidence in that room is so thick you could cut it with a bayonet. The strategic logic appears unassailable to the men planning Operation Stalemate II. General Douglas MacArthur is preparing his triumphant return to the Philippines, a promise he made when Japanese forces drove him out 2 years earlier. His planned invasion route will bring American ships and troops within range of Japanese airfields scattered across the Palau Islands. Peleliu hosts one of these airfields, a coral runway carved from the island's southern tip. If Japanese bombers operating from that runway attack MacArthur's exposed fleet, they could turn his glorious return into a catastrophic slaughter. Therefore, the reasoning goes, Peleliu must be neutralized. The 1st Marine Division, fresh from brutal fighting at Cape Gloucester, receives the assignment. These are not green troops. These are the same Marines who held Guadalcanal when the Pacific War hung by a thread. If anyone can take a small coral island in 3 days, it's them. Major General William Rupert commands the 1st Marine Division, and his confidence exceeds even that of the Pearl Harbor planners. Rupert is 53 years old, a career Marine who has waited his entire life for the kind of combat command that wins wars and makes reputations. He studies the aerial reconnaissance photographs of Peleliu with satisfaction. The beaches look clean and accessible. The island's interior shows some ridges and vegetation, but nothing like the mountainous terrain of other Pacific battlefields. His intelligence officers estimate 10,000 Japanese defenders, a number that seems manageable, given that he commands nearly 29,000 assault troops. At a planning conference, Rupert makes a prediction that will haunt him to his grave. A tough fight, but not more than 4 days. 5 at most. His subordinate officers exchange glances, but say nothing. You don't question a division commander, especially one as confident as Rupert's. They return to their units and repeat the timeline to their men. 4 days, maybe 5, then rest, rotation, and someone else's war. What none of these planners fully grasp is that the strategic situation is changing faster than their intelligence reports can track. By late July, American submarines have decimated Japan's merchant fleet, strangling the flow of resources to isolated island garrisons. Japanese aircraft production is collapsing under relentless bombing and raw material shortages. The airfield on Peleliu, which forms the entire justification for the invasion, is becoming less relevant with each passing week. Japanese planes rarely fly from Palau anymore. There's no fuel, no spare parts, no replacement aircraft. MacArthur's invasion fleet could sail past Peleliu without facing significant air attack, because the air threat has already been neutralized through attrition. But this information exists in scattered intelligence summaries and submarine patrol reports, never synthesized into a clear picture that might cause someone to ask the crucial question: is this invasion still necessary? In the planning apparatus of 1944, with momentum and doctrine driving every decision, such questions rarely get asked until it's far too late. The reconnaissance photographs that shape the invasion plan show Peleliu's beaches, vegetation, and the rough outline of ridge systems in the island's interior. What they don't show, what they cannot show, is what lies beneath the surface. Aerial cameras in 1944 can't penetrate jungle canopy or photograph the inside of caves. They can't reveal that the Japanese have been transforming Peleliu for the past 6 months, turning a simple defensive position into something the Pacific War has never seen before. Small dark spots visible on some photographs are dismissed as natural cave mouths or blast damage from American bombing raids. No one considers that these might be the firing ports of fortifications 30 feet deep in solid coral, connected by tunnel systems that run for thousands of feet. The men studying these photographs see what they expect to see: another Japanese-held island that will fall to American firepower and marine courage in a matter of days. They have taken 24 islands using this playbook. Why would Peleliu be any different? Admiral William Bull Halsey commands the 3rd Fleet, which includes the naval forces assigned to support the Peleliu invasion. Unlike the planners and ground commanders, Halsey harbors deep reservations about the operation. His staff has been tracking the declining Japanese air threat from Palau. His intelligence officers have noted the suspicious lack of Japanese aerial reconnaissance over American staging areas, suggesting their air forces are already combat ineffective. On August 15th, Halsey sends a remarkable message to Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of all Pacific forces, recommending that the Palau operation be canceled entirely. The Philippines invasion is moving ahead of schedule. The Japanese are weaker than anticipated. The risk-to-reward ratio for Peleliu is becoming unfavorable. Nimitz reads Halsey's recommendation with interest, but ultimately decides the operation will proceed. Too much planning has been invested. Too many resources have been allocated. The bureaucratic momentum of a major amphibious assault cannot be stopped 6 weeks before D-Day, not without evidence of immediate danger. Halsey's concerns are noted, filed, and ultimately ignored. Throughout August and early September, Marines board transport ships in the Russell Islands and Guadalcanal, steaming north toward an island most of them have never heard of. They attend briefings where officers show them maps and photographs. They clean weapons, write letters home, and try not to think too hard about what's coming. Many of these men are veterans. They survived Guadalcanal when the outcome of the entire Pacific War balanced on that single island. They slogged through the malarial hell of Cape Gloucester, fighting Japanese and disease in equal measure. They know what combat looks like, sounds like, smells like. When their officers say 3 to 4 days, the veterans nod politely, but pack extra ammunition anyway. You learn not to trust timelines in this war, but even the most experienced Marines, the ones who've seen the worst the Pacific can offer, cannot imagine what awaits them on Peleliu. Their experience has taught them to expect brutal beach assaults, savage jungle fighting, and suicidal banzai charges. They've developed tactics and techniques to counter these threats. They're ready for the war they know. What they're sailing toward is a war nobody knows, a new kind of defensive hell that will render all their hard-won experience almost useless. The final planning conference takes place aboard the command ship in early September. Rupert addresses his regimental commanders, spreading maps across the wardroom table. The 1st Marines will land on the left flank, the 5th Marines in the center, the 7th Marines on the right. The immediate objective is the airfield, sitting on flat ground just inland from the beaches. Once the airfield is secured, estimated at D-Day +1, the Marines will wheel north and south to clear the remainder of the island. Rupert points to the ridges visible on the map's interior, a roughly oblong area labeled the Umurbrogol, probably their main defensive position, he says. We'll reduce it with artillery and naval gunfire, then send in the infantry to mop up. Standard procedure. His colonels study the contour lines on the map, noting the steep terrain, but nobody voices serious concern. They've reduced fortified positions before. They have tanks, flamethrowers, artillery, unlimited naval gunfire support, and complete air superiority. How long can a few thousand Japanese troops hold out in caves? The meeting concludes with handshakes and confident words. Everyone returns to their ships to finalize loading plans and conduct last-minute rehearsals. 1,500 miles to the west, on Peleliu itself, a different kind of meeting is taking place. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa gathers his senior officers in an underground command post, reviewing the defensive preparations one final time. They have transformed this small island into a fortress. They have studied American tactics at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam. They know what's coming: overwhelming naval bombardment, airstrikes, then waves of Marines backed by tanks and artillery. The old Japanese defensive doctrine, defend at the beaches, launch banzai charges, die gloriously, has failed on every island where it was tried. Nakagawa has different orders from higher command: make them pay for every yard, kill 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier, hold out as long as possible, no suicidal charges, fight from fortified positions, and make the Americans dig you out cave by cave. His officers understand the implications. They will not be reinforced. They will not be evacuated. They will die on this island, but they will make that death count. As the meeting concludes, Nakagawa looks at the calendar, September 14th. He estimates the Americans will invade within days. Everything is ready. On the evening of September 14th, 1944, Marines aboard the invasion fleet can see Peleliu on the horizon. From the ships it looks harmless, a low green line against the sunset, smaller than they expected. Some of the men play cards, others write final letters. A few gather for religious services led by Navy chaplains. The ship's loudspeakers announce that H-hour is set for 08:30 the following morning. The weather forecast is good. The Navy promises 3 days of preparatory bombardment have destroyed most Japanese positions. Everything is proceeding according to plan. In the darkness, the massive invasion fleet assumes its final formation. Battleships and cruisers move close to shore, their gun batteries loaded and ready for the dawn bombardment. Troop transports position themselves for the assault waves. Landing craft are lowered into the water, engines checked and rechecked. In a few hours, 28,000 Marines will wade ashore on Peleliu, expecting a tough fight lasting 3 to 5 days. What they will actually encounter is a 74-day nightmare that will kill or wound 40% of everyone who lands, destroy entire battalions, and ultimately prove strategically unnecessary. But in these final peaceful hours before dawn, none of that is known. There is only the quiet water, the dark island, and the terrible confidence of men sailing toward a battle they think they understand. March 7, 1944. A Japanese transport ship approaches Peleliu through the pre-dawn darkness, running without lights to avoid American submarines. On deck, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa stands at the rail, studying his new command through binoculars. He is 43 years old, a veteran of China campaigns, and he knows he is sailing toward his death. The orders in his briefcase are explicit. Transform Peleliu into a fortress, hold it as long as possible. Inflict maximum casualties on the Americans. There is no promise of reinforcement, no hope of relief, no possibility of victory in any traditional sense. As the transport enters the harbor and Nakagawa gets his first clear view of the island in daylight, he sees something the American reconnaissance pilots will miss for months: a landscape perfectly designed for defensive warfare. The southern end is flat, dominated by the airfield, but the northern two-thirds rises in a chaotic jumble of coral ridges, some reaching 500 feet high, riddled with natural caves. The Americans will see an island. Nakagawa sees a fortress that nature has already half built. Within days of assuming command, Nakagawa gathers his engineering officers and begins walking every foot of Peleliu's interior, the ridge system that will come to be called the Umurbrogol by Americans. Nakagawa knows it by its Japanese designation, but the concept is the same, offers advantages beyond anything he could have hoped for. The ridges are solid coral limestone, compressed over millions of years into rock harder than concrete. Natural caves perforate the entire system, some vast enough to hold 100 men, connected by fissures and passages. But nature alone is not enough. Nakagawa orders his engineers to begin a construction project unprecedented in the Pacific War. They will expand the natural caves into a three-dimensional defensive network. They will connect isolated positions with tunnels. They will create fighting positions that are invulnerable to naval bombardment, invisible from the air, and mutually supporting. Every cave entrance will be positioned to cover another position. Every tunnel will have multiple exits. Every defensive position will be designed so Marines cannot approach it without being shot at from 3 directions simultaneously. The engineering work begins immediately, and it is backbreaking. Nakagawa's garrison includes the 14th Infantry Division's 2nd Regiment, along with naval troops, labor battalions, and specialized units, approximately 10,900 men total. Using hand tools, explosives, and sheer desperate labor, they begin transforming Peleliu. Engineers use explosives to blast new caves and expand existing ones. They dig tunnels connecting previously isolated positions. They install ventilation systems using bamboo pipes and carefully calculated air shafts. They create multi-story fighting positions inside the ridges, with ammunition stored on lower levels and firing ports on upper levels. They design the cave mouths to be invisible from the sea and air, hidden by vegetation, or positioned in defilade behind coral outcroppings. Within the caves, they build storage rooms for ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies. They install electric lights powered by generators deep inside the ridge system. They create underground hospitals, command posts, and barracks. What emerges over 6 months of intensive labor is not a traditional defensive line, but a coral fortress, a fortified zone where every square yard is a potential firing position, and every approach is a killing ground. Nakagawa is not working in isolation. He has studied detailed reports from every Japanese defensive failure in the Pacific. At Tarawa, the Japanese defended at the waterline and were annihilated by naval gunfire. At Saipan and Guam, they launched banzai charges that resulted in slaughter. The tactical pattern is clear. Japanese troops fighting in the open or in shallow fortifications are destroyed by overwhelming American firepower. But troops fighting from deep caves and reverse slope positions can survive bombardment and inflict serious casualties. Nakagawa receives explicit guidance from higher command in Palau: abandon the old doctrine. No more defense at the beaches. No more suicidal banzai charges. Instead, allow the Americans to land unopposed. Let them take the airfield. Then, from the ridges, destroy them with methodical, disciplined fire. Make them come into the caves to kill you. Every man in the garrison receives the same order. You will not die gloriously in a single charge. You will die slowly, taking 10 Americans with you before you fall. The defensive system that takes shape has several key features. First, almost all positions are built on reverse slopes, the sides of ridges facing away from the sea. This renders them immune to naval gunfire, which has to arc over the ridge crests to reach them. Second, firing ports are positioned at ground level or in defilade, making them nearly impossible to spot until they open fire. Third, the caves go deep. Some extend 200 feet into the coral, with multiple levels and chambers. Bombs and shells may collapse cave mouths, but the defenders simply retreat deeper and emerge from alternative exits. Fourth, the entire system is interconnected. A Marine squad that clears one cave and moves on will find themselves shot at from that same position hours later, as Japanese troops redeploy through the tunnel network. Fifth, the terrain itself is weaponized. The ridges form natural obstacles with only a few approaches, all easily covered by fire. The coral is so sharp it shreds clothing and skin. The heat radiating from the white coral reaches 115 degrees in direct sun, turning every assault into a race against heat exhaustion. By August, Nakagawa's fortress is nearly complete. His men have created over 500 fortified positions, caves, bunkers, and pillboxes, forming an integrated defensive zone covering roughly 1 square mile of ridgeline. The Americans will call this area Bloody Nose Ridge, but that single name obscures the complexity of what Nakagawa has built. The ridge system includes 5 major peaks that will be designated the Five Sisters, dozens of smaller hills and outcroppings, all connected by ravines, draws, and hidden approaches. Within this system, Nakagawa positions his infantry companies, naval troops, and specialized anti-tank units. Heavy weapons are sighted to cover every approach. Artillery is positioned in caves where it cannot be counter-battery. Mortars are placed in pits with overhead cover, positioned to drop fire on the flat ground near the airfield. Anti-aircraft guns are repurposed as direct-fire weapons, positioned to shoot down draws and ravines. Machine guns are emplaced in positions with overlapping fields of fire. The entire system is designed on the principle of mutual support. If you attack any position, you are automatically exposed to fire from at least 2 others. Nakagawa also addresses the logistical challenge of sustaining this defense. Water is critical in Peleliu's tropical heat, so his engineers dig deep wells and install cisterns in major cave complexes. Food is stockpiled, rice, canned goods, dried fish, enough for months. Ammunition is distributed throughout the system, so no single strike can destroy all supplies. Medical facilities are established deep in the largest caves. Communications wire is run through protected trenches and tunnels. Nakagawa even arranges for the construction of a small concrete bunker to serve as his command post, positioned deep within the ridge system where he can coordinate the entire defense while remaining immune to artillery fire. The attention to detail is remarkable. This is not a hastily improvised position, but a deliberately engineered fortress, designed by a professional soldier who knows he's fighting his last battle and intends to make it count. The garrison itself reflects Nakagawa's defensive philosophy. Unlike earlier Pacific battles where Japanese troops were encouraged to seek death in glorious charges, Nakagawa's men are trained in disciplined, methodical defense. They practice firing from their positions and then immediately retreating into caves before American artillery can respond. They rehearse movement through the tunnel system until they can navigate in total darkness. They learn to hold their fire until American troops are at close range, maximizing casualties. They prepare psychologically for a battle with no hope of rescue or relief. Nakagawa makes no inspiring speeches about victory. Instead, he frames the mission in stark terms. The Americans are coming. We cannot stop them from landing. We cannot drive them off the island, but we can make them pay such a terrible price that Japan gains time to prepare its final defenses. Every day we hold Peleliu is one more day for the homeland. Every American we kill is one less invader Japan must face. It is a grim calculus, but his men accept it. They are soldiers of the empire, and this is their assigned duty. As September approaches and intelligence reports confirm an American invasion is imminent, Nakagawa makes his final preparations. He orders supplies moved from vulnerable positions into the deepest caves. He confirms that all units understand their sectors and withdrawal routes. He burns all non-essential documents and correspondence, including personal letters. He writes a final message to his wife and 4 children, expressing regret that he will not see them again, but confidence that his duty is honorable. The message is entrusted to a departing supply ship, one of the last vessels that will leave Peleliu before the invasion. On the evening of September 14th, Nakagawa walks the ridge system one last time, checking positions and speaking with soldiers. The men are ready. The fortress is complete. All that remains is the waiting. From his command post, Nakagawa can see the ocean to the south. He knows that somewhere beyond the horizon, an American fleet is gathering. He has done everything possible to prepare. Now the battle will reveal whether his preparations are sufficient. The fundamental asymmetry of what's about to happen on Peleliu is worth understanding. The Americans are bringing overwhelming material superiority: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of troops, unlimited ammunition. They have doctrine, training, and recent victory after victory. What they don't have, what they can't have, is knowledge of what they're facing. The reconnaissance photographs don't show the caves. The intelligence estimates don't account for the depth and sophistication of the defenses. The battle plans assume a conventional Japanese defense that can be overwhelmed with conventional American tactics. Nakagawa, by contrast, has very limited resources, but near-perfect knowledge. He knows exactly where the Americans must land. He knows what routes they must take to advance. He knows they will rely on tanks, artillery, and naval gunfire, and he has designed his defenses to neutralize all 3. The coming battle will be a collision between American assumptions and Japanese preparation, between doctrine and innovation, between overwhelming force and perfect defensive terrain. The Americans expect to win quickly because they always have. Nakagawa expects to lose slowly because that is his mission. In this collision of expectations, thousands of young men on both sides are about to die for an island that matters less with each passing day. September 10, 1944, aboard the troopship USS DuPage, steaming north through the Philippine Sea, Private First Class Eugene Sledge sits on his bunk, writing a letter home to Mobile, Alabama. He is 20 years old, a replacement mortarman assigned to Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. This is his first combat operation, and fear coils in his stomach like barbed wire. Around him, older Marines are checking weapons, playing cards, sleeping, performing the familiar rituals of men who have done this before. Sledge writes carefully, telling his parents he's fine, the weather is good, nothing to worry about. He doesn't mention that his hands shake when he tries to load mortar shells. He doesn't mention the nightmares that started after the practice bombardments. He doesn't mention that the veterans around him have stopped talking about Peleliu as a quick operation, and now just call it the next one with grim resignation. He signs the letter, seals the envelope, and hopes his mother won't notice how the ink smears where sweat dripped from his hands. The 1st Marine Regiment loading aboard ships in the Russell Islands represents one of the most experienced units in the Pacific Theater, and that experience hangs on them like a weight. These are the men who held Henderson Field on Guadalcanal when the outcome of the entire war hung in the balance. They fought in malarial jungle, on starvation rations, against Japanese forces that attacked with suicidal fanaticism night after night. They won that battle, but came off Guadalcanal looking like walking skeletons, riddled with disease and exhaustion. 6 months later, the division threw them into Cape Gloucester, another malarial hellhole where they fought rain, mud, and disease as much as the enemy. They won again, but the cost was devastating. Men died from cerebral malaria, from fungal infections that rotted their feet, from tropical diseases that had no names or cures. The regiment rotated back to rest areas, but rest in 1944 means training for the next operation. Now barely recovered, they're heading back into combat. The men are veterans, yes, but they're also exhausted in ways that have no medical diagnosis. Company C, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, is commanded by Captain Everett Pope, a 24-year-old officer from Massachusetts who graduated from Bowdoin College and joined the Marines looking for adventure. By September 1944, Pope has found more adventure than any sane man would want. He gathers his platoon leaders in the DuPage's wardroom to review the invasion maps. The maps show Peleliu's beaches, the airfield, and rough contours of the interior ridges. Pope points to their assigned landing beach, White Beach 1, the leftmost section of the invasion front. We land in the first wave, he tells them. Secure the beach, push inland to these ridges, clear any opposition. The platoon leaders study the map's interior, noting terrain features labeled with ominous names they don't yet understand. The Umurbrogol, the Five Sisters, Bloody Nose Ridge. These are just names now, innocent-looking contour lines on paper. Within days, these same officers will watch their companies destroyed, trying to take these positions. But in the wardroom, there's only the map, the mission, and the carefully maintained professional calm that officers project to avoid spooking their men. The regiment's average age is somewhere between 19 and 21, though exact statistics are impossible because so many men lied about their age to enlist. The old men are sergeants and staff sergeants in their mid-20s, ancient by Marine infantry standards. Most enlisted straight out of high school went through basic training at Paris Island or San Diego, joined the division as replacements, and found themselves veterans by default after surviving their first battle. They know things college professors don't teach and can't imagine. They know what a bullet sounds like passing close to your head, a sharp crack versus the distant buzzing of far misses. They know how to sleep sitting up in a fighting hole, weapon across your knees, waking instantly at any unusual sound. They know how to identify whether incoming fire is rifle, machine gun, or mortar by the sound signature. They know how to stay alive. But knowing how to survive conventional jungle fighting doesn't prepare you for what Nakagawa has built on Peleliu, and the terrible irony is that their experience might actually hurt them. They think they know what to expect. They don't. Below decks on the transport ships, Marines deal with pre-battle stress in various ways. Some write letters trying to compress their fear and love into a few sentences that might be the last their families ever read. Others clean weapons obsessively, field stripping and reassembling rifles until they can do it blindfolded. A few gather for prayer services, led by Navy chaplains who wear crosses over dungaree uniforms and carry no weapons because of Geneva Convention protections that mean nothing to Japanese soldiers. Poker games run continuously, with cigarettes and script money changing hands. The veterans know to travel light, ditch anything not essential, because you'll be carrying it through hell. The replacements, by contrast, pack everything they were issued, trusting that the Marine Corps wouldn't give them gear they didn't need. They will learn otherwise. In combat, most men end up carrying their weapon, ammunition, water, and nothing else. Everything else gets thrown away in the first hours, when the weight becomes unbearable. Company 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, will suffer 71% casualties on Peleliu, one of the highest loss rates of any company in the entire Pacific War. But on September 10th, those men are alive, joking, complaining about the food, griping about officers, speculating about how long the battle will last. Private First Class R.V. Bergen, a Texas mortarman, runs an ongoing poker game. PFC Sterling Mace writes letters to a girl back in New York, hoping she'll wait for him. Corporal Wayburn Hall, from Arkansas, cleans his rifle for the 10th time. They are ordinary American kids, farm boys, city kids, high school athletes, college dropouts, wearing Marine uniforms, and heading into a battle that will kill or wound most of them. Some will die on the beach. Others will die in the ridges. A few will make it through physically unscathed but psychologically shattered. None will be the same person who boarded these ships. The night before the invasion, the mood aboard the ships is subdued. The loudspeakers announce final details. H-hour is 0830. First wave hits the beach at 0832. Pack all gear. Letters must be turned in by 2100 hours. Religious services will be held at 2200 hours. Men gather on deck to watch the sun set over an ocean that looks deceptively peaceful. From the ships, they can see Peleliu on the horizon, a dark smudge against the evening sky. It doesn't look like much. It doesn't look like the kind of place that will kill 2,000 Americans and wound 8,000 more. It looks like a small tropical island, the kind you'd see on a travel poster. The veterans know better than to judge by appearances, but even they can't imagine what's waiting. They've fought Japanese who charged across open ground in suicidal banzai attacks. They've fought Japanese in jungle ambushes. They've fought fanatical enemies who preferred death to surrender. What they haven't fought is an enemy who spent 6 months turning an island into a fortress, and who has no intention of dying quickly. Eugene Sledge attends the religious service in the ship's crew quarters. The chaplain is a young officer, probably not much older than Sledge himself, reading from a Bible with a flashlight because running lights are prohibited this close to enemy territory. He reads Psalm 23, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and the familiar words take on terrible weight. Sledge looks around at the faces of the men singing hymns, seeing fear, determination, resignation. Some of these faces will be corpses within 24 hours. Others will be screaming in aid stations, missing limbs, guts spilled out, calling for mothers or medics. The chaplain offers a prayer for courage and deliverance. Sledge mouths the words but doesn't feel delivered. He feels like a sacrifice being led to an altar he can't see but can sense waiting in the darkness. By 0200 hours on September 15th, most Marines have given up on sleep. They lie in their bunks in the darkness, listening to the creaking of the ship and the distant thunder of the pre-invasion bombardment beginning. The Navy has promised 3 days of bombardment, an unprecedented pounding that is supposed to destroy Japanese positions and make the landing easy. The Marines can hear the heavy guns firing, feel the vibration through the ship's hull. They imagine what it must be like on Peleliu, tons of high explosive raining down on Japanese positions. They hope the bombardment is as devastating as the Navy claims. They hope there won't be much opposition when they hit the beach. They hope they'll survive long enough to write another letter home. Hope is cheap and abundant the night before an invasion. Reality is a few hours away. At 0500 hours, the ships come to general quarters. Marines stumble up from below decks, burdened with combat gear. They eat breakfast steak and eggs, the traditional pre-invasion meal. Though most men are too nervous to eat much, they draw ammunition, checking magazines and grenades. They gather at their assigned assembly areas, waiting for the order to board landing craft. As dawn breaks over Peleliu, the island is visible through a haze of smoke and dust from the bombardment. It looks like hell itself is being unleashed on that small piece of coral. The Marines watch the fireworks and tell themselves it'll be easy. The Navy has pulverized the defenses. The Japanese are probably all dead or running. This will be a walkover. These are the lies men tell themselves before battles, the necessary fictions that make it possible to climb into a landing craft and head toward a hostile shore. The truth that the bombardment is barely scratching Nakagawa's deep defenses, that most Japanese are safely underground waiting for the Marines to land, that this is going to be worse than anything they've experienced, remains hidden on the far side of the horizon, waiting to be discovered at the cost of thousands of lives. September 15th, 1944, 0832 hours. The first wave of amphibious tractors churns toward Peleliu's beaches, carrying Marines who are about to learn that everything they know about war is wrong. The naval bombardment lifts as the Amtraks approach shore, shells screaming overhead to hit targets further inland. For approximately 90 seconds, there is almost silence except for the roar of engines. Then the world explodes. Japanese artillery and mortars, positioned in caves that the 3-day bombardment didn't touch, open fire with devastating accuracy. Shells bracket the approaching Amtraks, geysers of water erupting. The first vehicle takes a direct hit 50 yards from shore, disintegrating in a ball of flame. Marines spill into the water, some swimming, others sinking under the weight of their gear. Those who make it to the surface find themselves swimming through burning fuel oil, skin blistering as they struggle toward a beach that is erupting with gunfire from positions they cannot see. The landing beaches are designated White 1 and 2 on the north, Orange 1 and 2 in the center, and other designations running south. The first Marines hit White Beach in the northern sector, exactly where Nakagawa predicted they would land. As the Amtraks grind up onto the coral beach, Marines scramble out and immediately take fire from the ridges 400 yards inland. The bullets are coming from invisible sources, no muzzle flashes visible, no positions to return fire against. Marines drop in windows, shot by enemies they cannot see. The doctrinal response to taking fire is to locate the source and suppress it with overwhelming firepower. But how do you suppress a position you can't find? Men crawl forward, trying to get off the beach and find cover. The coral provides none. Every shell crater is sharp-edged and shallow. Every coral outcropping is too low to hide behind. And everywhere, from positions that seem to be inside the very rock itself, Japanese gunfire pours down like rain. By 0900 hours, 30 minutes after the first wave landed, the entire beach is chaos. Wounded men lie screaming in the open, but corpsmen who try to reach them are shot down. Amtraks attempting to return to the ships for more troops are hit by artillery and burn on the beach, adding smoke to the already obscured battlefield. Company commanders try to organize their units, but find their radios jammed or destroyed. Officers stand up to give orders and are immediately shot. The heat is already becoming unbearable. Ambient temperature over 100 degrees, and that's before accounting for the radiant heat from white coral that acts like a reflector oven. Men's canteens are empty within an hour, and the water resupply that was supposed to come ashore with later waves is either destroyed or stuck on the reef. Marines are dying from heat exhaustion before they're even shot. The initial objective, seize the airfield by D-Day +2, is reached by noon on D-Day itself, which sounds like success but is actually catastrophic. The Marines push forward so quickly, not because they're winning, but because the Japanese aren't defending where the Americans expected. Nakagawa has abandoned the entire southern half of the island, pulling his forces back into the northern ridges. The airfield sits empty, undamaged. An invitation. Marines reach it, spread out, and immediately come under murderous fire from the ridges to the north. Every position on the airfield is exposed to observation and fire from higher ground. Artillery begins falling, precisely ranged, clearly pre-registered. Mortars drop in with metronomic regularity. The Marines realize with sick horror that they've captured an objective that is actually a killing zone, a flat piece of ground surrounded by high ground, held by an enemy who can see everything and hit anything. The airfield, the entire reason for this invasion, is unusable. It will remain unusable for the entire battle. Captain Everett Pope's Company C, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, reaches the base of the ridges in late afternoon. They have crossed the airfield under artillery fire, suffering casualties with every yard. Now they stand at the foot of coral cliffs that rise 50 to 70 feet nearly vertically. The cliffs are honeycombed with cave mouths, most invisible until you're right on top of them. Pope receives orders to take the ridge line, designated Hill 100, on the map, later to be known as Pope's Ridge. The distance from their current position to the hilltop is approximately 200 yards. The elevation gain is perhaps 150 feet. In peacetime, it would be a challenging scramble. In combat under fire from positions that cannot be seen, it becomes a nightmare climb. Pope organizes his company for the assault, calling for artillery support. The shells crash into the ridge, throwing up spectacular clouds of coral dust, but doing no visible damage to the defenses. When the barrage lifts, Pope's men advance. The assault on Pope's Ridge is a preview of everything that will go wrong on Peleliu for the next 2 months. The Marines advance up the slope in small teams, trying to use every fragment of cover. Japanese fire comes from cave mouths, from crevices in the coral, from positions that seem impossible. Men are hit and tumble back down the slope. Others press on. The coral is so sharp it cuts through dungarees and boot leather, leaving bloody trails. The climb is exhausting in the heat. Men gasp for breath, vision narrowing from exertion and dehydration. Machine gun fire from somewhere above cuts down entire squads. Grenades roll down the slope toward the advancing Marines. Step by step, yard by yard, the survivors push upward. They reach the crest at the cost of half the company. 90 men reduced to perhaps 40 or 50 effectives. And then the worst part, holding the position they've just taken. On top of Pope's Ridge, the surviving Marines dig in as best they can. The coral is too hard for entrenching tools. The best they can manage are shallow scrapes behind coral outcroppings. As darkness falls, they realize they're completely exposed. The hilltop they've taken is actually just one position in a complex of ridges. Higher ground surrounds them on 3 sides. Japanese troops can move through tunnels beneath them, emerging to attack from any direction. Through the night, infiltration attacks come in waves. Not banzai charges, these are methodical probes, small groups of Japanese soldiers trying to break through the Marine perimeter. The Marines fight them off at close range, sometimes hand-to-hand. By dawn, Company C has 9 men still able to fight. 9 men out of 90 who started the assault. They have held the ridge, technically, but at a cost so appalling it defies comprehension. Pope will receive the Medal of Honor for this action. It will feel hollow to him for the rest of his life. Across the entire battlefield, the first day ends with a perimeter established, but at a cost nobody anticipated. Roughly 1,100 Marines are casualties, dead, wounded, or missing, out of approximately 9,000 men landed. That's a 12% casualty rate in one day, higher than the first day of Tarawa, higher than most commanders thought possible given the supposed effectiveness of the pre-invasion bombardment. The wounded overwhelm the aid stations. Corpsmen work by flashlight, trying to stabilize shattered bodies. The serious cases are evacuated to ships offshore, but the process is chaotic because the reef makes boat traffic hazardous. Some wounded men die waiting for evacuation that never comes. Others die on the boats, bleeding out before they reach medical facilities. The dead are laid out in rows on the beach, covered with ponchos if there are ponchos available, left exposed if there aren't. Already, in the tropical heat, the bodies are beginning to decompose. Division headquarters receives the casualty reports and reacts with disbelief. Over 1,000 casualties on the first day. The intelligence estimates must have been wrong. The Japanese garrison must be larger than reported. But that doesn't explain the tactical situation. The Americans have taken all their initial objectives, including the airfield, yet they're taking casualties at an unsustainable rate. General Rupert looks at the map, trying to understand what's happening. The reports from frontline units all say the same thing. Taking heavy fire from invisible positions, cannot locate source. Conventional tactics ineffective. Rupert's orders continued attacks for the next day. The assault must maintain momentum. The alternative, admitting that the battle plan is fundamentally flawed, is unthinkable. So the attacks will continue. More Marines will climb those ridges. More will die trying to take positions that cannot be held even if captured. The arithmetic of Peleliu is already clear to anyone willing to see it. This battle will consume the entire division unless someone has the courage to stop it. No one does. By midnight on D-Day, the surviving Marines in frontline positions lie in their shallow fighting holes, exhausted beyond anything they've experienced. They've been in combat for 16 hours straight, most without food or adequate water. The temperature has dropped from daytime highs, but it's still over 80 degrees. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds. The smell of death is already pervasive, bodies decomposing in the heat, the coppery smell of blood, the acrid stench of explosives. In the darkness, Japanese infiltrators move through no man's land, trying to penetrate the Marine lines. Sporadic gunfire cracks through the night, flares pop overhead, casting shadows that move and trick tired eyes into seeing threats everywhere. The Marines have been told this battle will last 3 to 4 days. They've survived 1 day at tremendous cost. 3 more days of this seems impossible. What they don't know, what nobody knows yet, is that this is just the beginning. The real horror of Peleliu is still waiting in those ridges, in those caves, in that coral fortress that conventional tactics cannot crack. Tomorrow they will discover just how wrong all their assumptions were. September 16, 1944. 0600 hours. Corpsman John Bradley moves through the aid station on White Beach, stepping over wounded men who cover every foot of available space. He is 19 years old, from Wisconsin, trained to save lives, but finding that training catastrophically inadequate for what Peleliu delivers. The man in front of him has a shrapnel wound in his thigh that should be survivable with proper treatment, but the wound is already infected, angry red streaks radiating up toward the groin. Bradley irrigates the wound with sterile water, applies sulfa powder, and bandages it as best he can. He knows it won't be enough. Coral dust has infiltrated the wound, microscopic particles of fossilized limestone that the immune system reads as foreign invaders. Within 24 hours, this infection will be systemic. Within 48 hours, even if the Marine survives combat, he'll be facing amputation to save his life. Bradley moves to the next patient, and the next, and the next, discovering the same pattern. Almost every wound is infected with coral contamination. Peleliu isn't just a battlefield. It's a biological weapon disguised as an island. The coral that forms Peleliu is millions of years old, compressed into rock harder than concrete and sharper than broken glass. It has 2 immediate effects on combat operations. First, it's nearly impossible to dig into. Entrenching tools designed to cut through soil and clay bounce off Peleliu's coral with jarring impacts that numb Marines' hands. The best anyone can manage are shallow scrapes, offering minimal protection from artillery and mortar fire. Second, the coral creates wounds unlike anything corpsmen have trained for. When a bullet strikes coral, it fragments and sprays microscopic shards in every direction. When a shell explodes on coral, it creates a sandblast effect of razor-sharp particles. When a man falls on coral, it cuts through fabric and skin like a serrated knife, leaving wounds that look minor but are packed with coral fragments that guarantee infection. By the second day, corpsmen are seeing infection rates approaching 100% for any wound that breaks the skin. The heat compounds every medical problem. Daytime temperatures routinely exceed 105 degrees Fahrenheit, but that's measured in shade, and there is no shade on Peleliu. On the exposed coral ridges where the fighting rages, temperatures reach 115 degrees or higher. The white coral acts as a solar reflector, bouncing heat upward, so marines are cooked from below and above simultaneously. Under these conditions, the human body requires approximately 12 quarts of water per day to maintain function. Marines are issued 2 canteens holding 1 quart each. Basic arithmetic reveals the crisis. Even if both canteens are full at dawn, even if the water isn't contaminated or spilled, even if resupply comes as scheduled, Marines are still operating with a 6 to 8 quart daily deficit. Dehydration sets in within hours. Heat exhaustion follows. Men collapse even in positions where they're not being shot at. The water resupply system breaks down almost immediately. Water is brought ashore in fuel drums that were supposedly cleaned but often weren't, leaving the water with a petroleum taste that induces vomiting. Other water sources are contaminated when shells rupture fuel bladders, mixing gasoline or diesel with drinking water. On September 16th, an amphibian carrying water resupply takes a mortar hit just offshore. Marines watch 500 gallons of fresh water spill into the lagoon, mixing with the salt water and oil slicks from burning Amtraks, utterly wasted. Company commanders begin rationing water with increasing desperation. A capful per man at dawn, a capful at noon, a capful at dusk, if there's any left. Men's tongues swell, their lips crack and bleed, their urine turns dark brown, then stops entirely as kidneys begin to fail. Some try drinking from shell craters, despite knowing the water is contaminated with coral dust, fuel, and probably blood. They get dysentery, adding another medical crisis to an already overwhelmed system. Heat casualties mount throughout the day. Men simply collapse, core body temperatures rising above 110 degrees, the point where brain damage begins. Corpsmen recognize the symptoms: confusion, loss of coordination, then unconsciousness. The treatment is simple in theory: cool the patient down, rehydrate, but impossible in practice. There's no ice, no shade, no cool water. Corpsmen do what they can, moving patients into whatever shadow exists, using precious water to soak dungarees and create makeshift cooling. Many don't respond. Their bodies, already pushed beyond safe limits by dehydration and exertion, shut down despite treatment. The death certificates will say heat stroke as cause of death, which is technically true, but obscures the larger reality. Peleliu's environment is killing Marines as efficiently as Japanese bullets. The infection crisis reaches catastrophic levels by September 18th. The field hospital, established in a relatively protected area near the airfield, becomes a charnel house of suppurating wounds and gangrenous tissue. The standard treatment for combat wounds in 1944 is penicillin, the wonder drug that has saved countless lives in Europe. But penicillin supplies are exhausted within 3 days at Peleliu. The demand far exceeds any planning estimate because nobody anticipated the infection rate. Without penicillin, corpsmen fall back on older treatments: sulfa powder, wound irrigation, debridement of infected tissue. These help, but not enough. Wounds that should heal in 2 weeks take 2 months. Minor shrapnel hits that should require a few days of recovery instead require evacuation and weeks of hospital care. Some wounds, particularly those contaminated with coral fragments embedded deep in muscle tissue, never fully heal. Men are invalided out of the service with chronic infections that flare up for years after the battle ends. The coral creates other hazards beyond infection. Its razor-sharp edges cut through boot leather in days. Marines who land with intact footwear are marching on shredded boots within 72 hours, coral tearing at their feet with every step. Feet develop cuts, cuts become infected, and men lose the ability to walk. The division's supply system struggles to provide replacement boots. Nobody anticipated this rate of destruction. Some Marines end up wrapping their feet in canvas and tape, improvising protection that barely works. Their feet leave bloody prints on the coral as they advance. The official records will show thousands of Marines evacuated for foot injuries, a bland phrase that obscures the reality of men whose feet are so lacerated and infected they can no longer stand. The environmental crisis forces commanders to make impossible decisions. Continue attacking and watch your men collapse from heat and infection. Pull back and cede ground to an enemy who's already inflicting unbearable casualties. Reduce water rations further and risk even more heat casualties. Increase water delivery and expose more supply runs to Japanese artillery. There are no good options. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Marines, watches his regiment literally dissolve, not from combat losses alone, but from the combined effects of heat, dehydration, and infection, eroding combat effectiveness faster than replacements can restore it. He requests additional water deliveries. He requests more medical supplies. He requests reinforcements. Higher headquarters promises everything but delivers only a fraction. The logistical system, designed for conventional combat, cannot adapt quickly enough to Peleliu's unique horrors. By the end of the first week, approximately 30% of marine casualties are environmental rather than combat-related. Heat exhaustion accounts for hundreds of evacuations. Dehydration claims dozens. Infection incapacitates hundreds more. These statistics would be shocking in any context, but they're even more devastating when you realize they're additional to the combat casualties. Peleliu is fighting a two-front war, against Japanese defenders and against the island itself. The Japanese can be fought with tactics and courage and firepower. The environment cannot. You cannot shoot heat. You cannot assault dehydration. You cannot suppress coral with artillery. The island itself is an enemy that doesn't tire, doesn't run out of ammunition, and inflicts casualties 24 hours a day without pause. And unlike the Japanese, who will eventually be defeated, the environment never surrenders. It remains hostile until the last Marine leaves, and even then, for men whose bodies carry coral fragments or chronic infections, the battle continues for decades. The medical officers file reports describing conditions that border on the incredible. One battalion surgeon notes that virtually every patient requires wound debridement to remove coral contamination. Another documents that infection rates exceed 90% for all wounded in action cases. A Navy doctor evacuated with severe heat exhaustion describes the field hospital as overwhelmed beyond any capacity to function. These reports travel up the chain of command, reaching staff officers who read them with disbelief. The reports describe a battlefield more hostile than anything encountered in previous Pacific campaigns. They describe an environmental crisis that rivals the tactical crisis. They describe in clinical medical language a hell that doctrine and training never anticipated. And they raise an uncomfortable question that nobody wants to ask. If the environment is this deadly in the first week, what happens in week 2, week 3, week 4? The human body can only endure so much. Peleliu is testing those limits and finding them far lower than anyone imagined. The island is winning a war of attrition that doesn't even require Japanese participation. September 19, 1944, 0500 hours. Captain Everett Pope gathers what remains of Company C in the pre-dawn darkness at the base of a coral cliff. His map designates as Hill 100. 4 days ago, he commanded 235 Marines. This morning, he counts 90 men still able to fight. The rest are dead, wounded, or collapsed from heat exhaustion. Division headquarters has just delivered new orders. Take Hill 100 and hold it. Deny the Japanese observation over the airfield. The orders sound simple, almost routine. What they don't mention is that Hill 100 is the northern anchor of a ridge system the Marines are beginning to call Bloody Nose Ridge, a coral fortress so perfectly designed for defense that conventional tactics might as well be suicide notes. Pope studies the objective through binoculars as dawn breaks. The hill rises approximately 150 feet above his position, its slopes broken by crevices and coral outcroppings. He cannot see any Japanese positions, but he knows they're there, watching him, waiting. He turns to his platoon leaders and gives the order every officer dreads. We're going up. The Umurbrogol Ridge system that dominates northern Peleliu covers roughly 800 yards by 500 yards of tortured coral landscape. To call it a ridge is misleading. It's more accurate to describe it as a chaos of jagged peaks, deep ravines, and interconnected coral formations, rising to 500 feet above sea level in places. The ridges run roughly north to south, with 5 major peaks soon to be designated the Five Sisters by exhausted Marines trying to make sense of the terrain. Between the peaks run narrow draws and valleys, each a natural choke point covered by Japanese fire from multiple directions. The coral itself has been eroded over millions of years into knife-edge formations, razor-sharp ridges barely wide enough to walk on, cliff faces that are nearly vertical. Vegetation clings to crevices, scrub brush, vines, trees twisted by the constant wind, but provides no concealment from Japanese positions that command every approach. This is terrain that favors defense over offense by orders of magnitude. Company C begins its assault at 0600 hours. advancing up the southern slope of Hill 100 in squad rushes. The Japanese hold their fire until the Marines are committed to the slope, too far advanced to pull back easily. Then the world explodes. Machine gun fire from invisible positions sweeps the slope. Mortars begin dropping with deadly accuracy, clearly pre-registered on this exact approach route. Marines go down in clusters. The survivors push forward because going back is as dangerous as going forward, and because Marine doctrine teaches that the only way through a killing zone is to assault through it. They scramble up coral ledges, hands and uniforms shredded by the razor edges. Japanese grenades roll down from above, exploding among the climbing men. The Marines throw their own grenades up the slope, hoping to suppress positions they cannot see. The noise is overwhelming: explosions, screaming, the crack of rifles and chatter of machine guns echoing off coral walls. By 0800 hours, the lead elements reach a position about 2/3 of the way up the slope. They've covered perhaps 100 yards in 2 hours and left 20 dead Marines scattered below them. Here the coral forms a natural terrace, offering slight protection from direct fire, but none from mortars. Corporal John Teskovich organizes the survivors into a defensive position, while Pope calls for artillery support. The forward observer, Lieutenant Willis, radios coordinates to the batteries positioned near the airfield. Within minutes, shells begin screaming overhead, impacting on the ridge crest above the Marines. The explosions are spectacular, huge clouds of coral dust and smoke rising into the morning air. Pope watches through binoculars, looking for signs of damage to Japanese positions. He sees none. When the barrage lifts, Japanese fire resumes immediately, as heavy as before. The artillery has accomplished nothing except depleting ammunition and possibly alerting the Japanese to exactly where the Marines are positioned. The fundamental problem becoming apparent to Pope and every other officer on Peleliu is that traditional American advantages, artillery, naval gunfire, air support, are nearly useless against Nakagawa's defenses. Artillery shells that would obliterate above-ground positions simply bounce off or explode on the surface of coral ridges, doing no damage to caves 20 or 30 feet deep. Naval gunfire, arcing in from ships offshore, has the same limitation: tremendous explosive power wasted against terrain that absorbs or deflects it. Airstrikes can drop bombs on ridge crests, but the Japanese positions are on reverse slopes, sheltered from aerial attack. Even direct hits on cave mouths rarely collapse the caves. They just seal the front entrance while Japanese troops retreat through tunnels to alternative exits. The Marines are fighting an enemy who is essentially invulnerable to everything except direct assault by infantry, and direct assault against these positions requires crossing open ground under observation and fire from positions that cannot be suppressed. It's a tactical nightmare with no obvious solution. Pope makes the decision to continue the assault. Staying on the terrace means eventual annihilation from mortars. Retreating means admitting failure and having to do this again tomorrow. The only option is forward. At 0930 hours, Company C resumes the attack. They advance in small groups, using every scrap of cover, moving when they can and crawling when they can't. The Japanese are firing from positions on the ridge crest and from cave mouths on the flanks, a crossfire that makes any movement suicidal. Marines die advancing. Marines die taking cover. Marines die trying to help wounded comrades. The company shrinks with every yard gained. By 1100 hours, the survivors, perhaps 40 men now, reach the crest of Hill 100. They've achieved their objective. The cost is staggering, but they hold the high ground. Now they have to survive there. The crest of Hill 100 is not a flat hilltop, but a jumbled coral formation, perhaps 30 yards across, broken by fissures and sharp outcroppings. The Marines immediately discover their tactical situation is even worse than imagined. They are not on the highest ground. Hill 100 is actually lower than adjacent peaks, meaning Japanese observers on those peaks can look directly down into the Marine positions. Every movement is visible to the enemy. Worse, the Marines discover they cannot dig in. The coral is impenetrable to entrenching tools. The best they can manage is piling loose coral rocks into low walls that offer minimal protection. Water is already critical. They've been climbing and fighting for 5 hours in 105-degree heat, and many canteens are empty. Food is irrelevant. Nobody can eat in this heat anyway, but the water situation is desperate. Pope radios for resupply, knowing it will be nearly impossible for anyone to climb that slope under fire, carrying water cans. As afternoon heat becomes unbearable, the Japanese begin probing attacks. These are not the banzai charges of earlier Pacific battles, but methodical, tactical movements, small groups trying to infiltrate the Marine perimeter, testing defenses, looking for weak points. The Marines fight them off at ranges so close they can hear Japanese soldiers talking to each other. Ammunition expenditure is enormous. Men are firing at shadows, at sounds, at any movement in the coral maze surrounding them. By mid-afternoon, ammunition is running low. Pope organizes a detail to strip ammunition from dead Marines on the slope below. A horrific but necessary task. The detail takes casualties doing this. Everything on Peleliu takes casualties. There is no safe activity, no secure location, no moment when you're not in danger. Dusk brings no relief. The Marines on Hill 100 realize they're surrounded. Japanese troops have moved through tunnels to positions below and around them. Radio contact with battalion headquarters is sporadic due to terrain interference. Pope requests permission to withdraw after dark, but the answer is unequivocal: hold the position. The night that follows is among the worst experienced by any American unit in the Pacific War. Japanese infiltrators attack repeatedly, trying to break through the perimeter. Fighting happens at arm's length, grenades thrown back and forth, rifles fired at muzzle flashes, hand-to-hand struggles on coral ledges, where a misstep means falling to your death. The Marines have no illumination except sporadic flares fired by mortarmen below, and the flares create as much confusion as clarity. Shadows leap and dance, making it impossible to distinguish movement from hallucination. Men fight exhaustion as much as the enemy, struggling to stay alert when every cell in their bodies screams for sleep. Dawn on September 20th reveals the cost. Company C, which started the assault with 90 men, now has 9 effectives. 9 Marines still capable of fighting, scattered across a coral hilltop, littered with empty shell casings and bloody bandages. The dead lie where they fell. There's been no time or safety to move them. The wounded, those who could be moved, were evacuated during brief lulls in the fighting, carried down the slope by stretcher bearers who deserve medals for every trip they made. Pope himself is unwounded physically, but looks like he's aged a decade overnight. He radios battalion headquarters with his situation report. Hill 100 is held, but Company C is combat ineffective. The response orders relief by another company and commends Pope for his leadership. In the military bureaucracy, that language will eventually translate to a Medal of Honor recommendation. To Pope, sitting on a coral ridge counting his dead, it feels like a poor trade, 8 medals in exchange for 81 dead and wounded Marines. The battle for Hill 100 is replicated across the entire Bloody Nose Ridge complex throughout late September. Other companies assault other hills with similar results. The 5th Marines attack the center of the ridge system. The 7th Marines push from the south. Every assault follows the same pattern: brutal approach under fire, terrible casualties climbing the ridges, brief success in taking positions, then the desperate struggle to hold against counterattacks and infiltration. The mathematics are inexorable. A Marine company is approximately 200 men. Attacking a fortified hill costs 50 to 70% casualties. Even in victory, you've destroyed your unit's combat effectiveness. And because the Japanese can move through tunnels, positions that are cleared one day are reoccupied the next, requiring the entire process to start over. The 1st Marine Regiment, which landed on Peleliu with roughly 3,000 men, is bled white in 8 days of fighting in the Umurbrogol. By September 23rd, the regiment has suffered 1,749 casualties, a 58% loss rate that makes it combat ineffective by any standard. The regiment is pulled off the line, finished as a fighting force. The men who walk off Bloody Nose Ridge are hollow-eyed ghosts, so psychologically damaged that many will never fully recover. The human cost of Bloody Nose Ridge cannot be adequately expressed in casualty statistics, though the numbers are horrific enough. What the statistics miss is the psychological destruction of fighting in terrain, where every advantage belongs to the enemy, where courage and skill and determination mean nothing against positions that are essentially invulnerable, where you watch your friends die for objectives that cannot be held even when taken. The Marines who survive Bloody Nose Ridge will later describe it in terms that transcend ordinary combat. They talk about the sense of utter helplessness, attacking positions they cannot see against an enemy who watches their every move. They describe the claustrophobia of fighting in coral crevices, where you cannot spread out, cannot maneuver, can only go forward into fire or backward through bodies. They remember the thirst that becomes more agonizing than the fear, the way your mind starts to fracture when you're dehydrated and exhausted and terrified all at once. Bloody Nose Ridge breaks something in the men who fight there. Not their courage, which remains intact, but their sense that warfare can be comprehended or mastered. They learn that some battles are simply machines that consume human beings, and the only difference between the living and the dead is random chance disguised as luck. September 20th, 1944, 1400 hours. Second Lieutenant Harold Warner stands at the base of a cave mouth in the southern Umurbrogol, sweating through his dungarees and studying a problem that doesn't appear in any Marine Corps manual. The cave entrance is roughly 8 feet high and 12 feet wide, positioned in a coral cliff face that offers no approach except across 30 yards of open ground. His platoon just tried to rush that cave. The tactical innovations that eventually reduced Peleliu's caves emerge not from high-level planning, but from desperate improvisation by junior officers and NCOs who adapt or die. The first breakthrough comes from an armored bulldozer, a standard Caterpillar D8 fitted with improvised steel plating bolted to the blade and driver's compartment. Engineers came up with this modification back at Cape Gloucester, where bulldozers clearing jungle tracks proved vulnerable to Japanese snipers. On Peleliu, someone realizes these armored dozers can do more than clear debris. They can approach positions that infantry cannot, using the blade as a shield. On September 21st, an armored dozer, commanded by Sergeant William Bordelon, advances on a fortified position that has resisted all attacks. Japanese fire bounces off the blade. Bordelon drives right up to the cave mouth and simply buries it. Thousands of pounds of coral rubble pushed into the entrance, sealing the occupants inside. The innovation spreads instantly. Within days, armored dozers are integral to every cave reduction operation. The second innovation involves coordinating weapons that were never designed to work together. The Marine Corps has tank-mounted flamethrowers, modified Sherman tanks, designated Satan or Ronson, depending on the flamethrower type, with ranges exceeding 100 yards. These can reach cave interiors that portable flamethrowers cannot, but tanks operating alone are vulnerable to magnetic mines and anti-tank guns. Infantry operating alone cannot suppress caves. Someone accounts differ on who deserves credit, develops a combined arms tactic. Armored dozer creates a path through broken coral. Sherman tank with flamethrower follows the dozer. Infantry follows the tank, providing security. When they reach a fortified cave, the process is methodical. Infantry suppresses the cave entrance with rifle fire, forcing Japanese defenders deep inside. Tank moves into position and pours flamethrower fuel into the cave, a stream of jellied gasoline that flows into every crevice and chamber. Then ignition. The fuel catches, creating an inferno that consumes oxygen and burns at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Anything living inside dies, from burns, from carbon monoxide poisoning, from oxygen deprivation. It's horrific, but effective. The third piece of the tactical evolution involves demolitions on a scale never before attempted in combat. Standard procedure for destroying bunkers calls for satchel charges, canvas bags containing 20 or 30 pounds of TNT or composition explosive. On Peleliu, this is inadequate. The caves are too deep, too well constructed. Engineers begin experimenting with larger charges, 50 pounds, 100 pounds, eventually 500 pounds or more. They develop techniques for lowering charges down vertical shafts on ropes, setting delayed fuses, and withdrawing before detonation. The largest caves require multiple attempts. On September 26th, engineers spend an entire day preparing a charge for a massive cave complex in the central Umurbrogol. They lower 300 pounds of TNT down a natural chimney, pack the charge with coral rock to direct the blast inward, set a 30-minute fuse, and withdraw. The explosion is heard across the island, a subsonic thump that rattles equipment 2 miles away. When the smoke clears, the cave system has partially collapsed, but movement is still detected inside. They do it again with 500 pounds. This time, the entire ridge section collapses, entombing an unknown number of Japanese troops in coral rubble. The tactical method that emerges from these separate innovations is later codified as blowtorch and corkscrew, a term that captures the systematic, grinding nature of cave warfare. The blowtorch is the flamethrower, burning out defenders. The corkscrew is the slow, methodical advance, drilling into the defensive position yard by yard. A typical cave reduction operation by late September follows this pattern. Reconnaissance identifies the cave and any visible firing ports. Artillery and mortars pound the area to suppress defenses and force Japanese troops underground. The armored dozer creates an approach route, pushing aside debris and filling shell craters. The flamethrower tank advances, covered by infantry. Engineers move up with demolition charges. The cave is attacked in sequence, flamethrower to neutralize immediate defenders, demolitions to collapse entrances and seal secondary exits, dozer to bury what remains. Then the infantry clears the position, going inside with flashlights and weapons to confirm no one survived. The entire process can take hours for a single cave. Complex cave systems require days. The human cost of developing these tactics is paid in marine blood. Every innovation requires trial and error in combat means death. Early attempts to use flamethrower tanks without adequate infantry support result in tanks destroyed by magnetic mines. Early demolition attempts with insufficient explosive result in failed charges, and Marines killed trying to recover unexploded ordnance. Early dozer operations without proper reconnaissance result in operators killed when dozers fall into hidden crevices or trigger buried mines. The learning curve is written in casualty reports, but gradually, painfully, the Marines develop techniques that work. By the end of September, cave reduction operations that would have been impossible 2 weeks earlier are becoming routine. Still dangerous, still costly, but achievable with acceptable casualties rather than suicidal losses. The equipment evolution keeps pace with tactical development. The portable flamethrowers carried by infantry prove inadequate, too short-ranged, too vulnerable. They're supplemented and then largely replaced by mechanized flamethrowers, larger units mounted on vehicles or hand carts with longer ranges and greater fuel capacity. The M2 mechanized flamethrower can shoot a stream of burning fuel 150 yards and carry enough fuel for multiple attacks. Demolition charges evolve from standard satchel charges to custom-built explosives designed for specific targets. Engineers fabricate shaped charges that direct explosive force inward into caves. They develop delayed fuses that give time for withdrawal, but don't give Japanese troops time to defuse the charge. They experiment with white phosphorus mixed with high explosives, creating charges that burn as well as blast. Every piece of equipment is tested in combat, modified based on results, and retested until it works. The tanks themselves undergo field modifications that would horrify peacetime maintenance officers, but prove essential in combat. Standard Sherman tanks bog down in Peleliu's broken coral, their tracks unable to grip the irregular surface. Crews weld additional track plates to the sides, creating wider contact surfaces. They remove sponson-mounted machine guns that are useless in cave warfare and redistribute the weight. They jury-rig additional armor on vulnerable points where Japanese anti-tank rifles can penetrate. The flamethrower tanks get special attention. Crews paint them to look like standard gun tanks, hoping to avoid drawing fire from Japanese troops who have learned that flamethrower tanks are priority targets. Nothing works perfectly, but everything works better than it did at the start of the battle. The improvisation and adaptation happening on Peleliu will later be studied at military academies as examples of tactical innovation under pressure. What those studies often miss is that every innovation required someone to die trying something that didn't work before they found something that did. The human element in these tactical developments deserves emphasis. The Marines and engineers perfecting cave warfare are mostly in their early 20s, leading men who are mostly teenagers. They're making life and death decisions based on incomplete information and developing tactics through bloody trial and error because higher headquarters has no solutions to offer. Lieutenant Warner, facing that cave on September 20th, doesn't have time to request guidance from division headquarters or consult with tactical experts. He has to solve the problem now, with the resources available, or watch more of his men die. So he improvises. He calls forward an engineer team with demolitions. He has his riflemen suppress the cave entrance, while the engineers low-crawl forward with a 50-pound shaped charge. The engineers set the charge at the cave mouth, light the fuse, and sprint back. The explosion is deafening, the shaped charge directing all its force into the cave interior. When the smoke clears, Warner leads a team inside. They find 3 dead Japanese machine gunners and a destroyed weapon. 1 cave cleared. Several hundred more remain. By the end of September, the Marines have developed a grim expertise in cave warfare. But expertise comes at a cost that's almost unbearable. Officers who understand these tactics are the ones who've survived long enough to learn them, and survival means watching subordinates die in the learning process. The psychological burden of ordering men into these attacks, knowing that some will die even if everything goes right, breaks some officers. They don't refuse orders or fail in their duty. The Marine Corps doesn't tolerate that, but something inside them fractures. They become mechanical, emotionless, issuing orders without inflection because showing emotion might reveal the guilt they carry. The enlisted men who execute these tactics carry their own burdens. They know they're doing necessary work, that these caves must be reduced, that every Japanese position that remains active is a position that can kill Marines for days or weeks to come. But necessity doesn't make the work less horrible. Burning human beings alive, even enemy combatants, even soldiers who would do the same to you, leave scars that don't heal. The men who operate the flamethrowers, who watch human figures emerge from caves, burning, screaming, collapsing, often refuse to talk about it afterward. Some drink to forget. Some have nightmares for decades. Some simply lock it away in mental rooms they never open. The tactical innovations that reduce Peleliu's caves work, but they work by unleashing horrors that consume the men who wield them almost as surely as they consume the enemy they're designed to kill. September 20th, 1944, 1800 hours. Major General William Rupert sits in his command tent near the captured airfield, reading casualty reports that should force him to reconsider everything about this operation. The 1st Marines, his most experienced regiment, has suffered nearly 1,000 casualties in 5 days. Combat effectiveness is degraded to the point where the regiment can barely function as a cohesive unit. The 5th and 7th Marines are being ground down almost as quickly. Total division casualties exceed 3,000 men, 1/3 of his combat strength, and the Japanese defensive position in the Umurbrogol remains largely intact. By any rational calculation, this battle is going catastrophically wrong. But Rupert doesn't make the rational calculation. Instead, he drafts a message to Admiral William Fort, the naval commander offshore, declining the offer of Army reinforcements from the 81st Infantry Division. The Marines will finish this alone. The decision will cost hundreds of lives and haunt Rupert to his grave. Understanding Rupert's decision requires understanding the institutional pride and inter-service rivalry that permeates the American military in 1944. The Marine Corps is the smallest service branch, perpetually fighting for relevance and resources. Marines have spent decades proving their elite troops capable of missions the Army cannot accomplish. Every successful amphibious assault, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, reinforces the narrative that Marines are uniquely qualified for Pacific warfare. The idea of requesting Army help on Peleliu, of admitting that Marines cannot complete a mission they were assigned, strikes at the core of institutional identity. Rupert knows that accepting Army reinforcements will be seen by some as Marine Corps failure. His superiors at Marine Corps headquarters will ask why he couldn't accomplish with an elite Marine division what supposedly would require Army support. His peers will question his competence. His subordinates will wonder if he's lost confidence in them. These considerations should be irrelevant compared to the lives at stake, but in the hothouse of military culture and career advancement, they weigh heavily. Rupert himself is not in ideal condition to make clear-headed decisions. Before the invasion, he suffered a broken ankle in a shipboard accident, a fall that should have resulted in medical evacuation and replacement. Instead, Rupert concealed the severity of the injury, relying on a cane and painkillers to maintain mobility. His subordinates know about the injury. You can't hide limping through the command area, but they don't realize how much pain he's in or how the constant discomfort affects his judgment. The painkillers he's taking cloud his thinking. The physical pain makes him irritable and short-tempered, with staff officers who bring bad news. More importantly, the injury becomes symbolic in Rupert's mind. He refused to let a broken ankle keep him from combat command. How can he now admit that his division cannot complete its mission? The physical injury and the tactical crisis become conflated in his thinking. Both challenges to be endured, rather than problems requiring adaptation. The first serious offer of reinforcement comes on September 20th, when Admiral Halsey radios Admiral Fort, suggesting that elements of the 81st Infantry Division, currently in reserve for the Palau operation, could be committed to Peleliu. Fort passes this recommendation to Rupert. The conversation is not recorded, but witnesses report that Rupert's response is immediate and emphatic. The Marines don't need Army help. The battle is proceeding according to plan. The Umurbrogol will be reduced within days. Requesting reinforcements would imply weakness and undermine morale. Fort, who is Navy rather than Marine, and thus less invested in inter-service politics, accepts Rupert's assessment reluctantly. He files a report noting his recommendation was declined by Ground Forces commander. The message goes into the record, a paper trail that will later prove significant when questions of accountability arise. Behind the scenes, Rupertus's own staff is increasingly alarmed by the situation. His intelligence officers know the casualty rates are unsustainable. His operations officers warn that continuing attacks with depleted units will result in tactical collapse. His medical officers report that heat casualties and infections are degrading combat power as quickly as Japanese fire. But Rupertus has surrounded himself with yes-men, officers who won't challenge his decisions. Those who try are dismissed or transferred. The command tent becomes an echo chamber where bad news is unwelcome and optimistic projections are reinforced, regardless of evidence. This is not unique to Rupertus. It's a failure mode that appears in military organizations under stress. But it's particularly dangerous on Peleliu, where the gap between official assessments and frontline reality is becoming enormous. September 23rd marks a crisis point. The 1st Marines are pulled off the line after 8 days of continuous combat, having suffered 58% casualties. The regiment is combat ineffective, unable to conduct offensive operations, barely able to defend positions it holds. The 5th Marines and 7th Marines are still functional, but degrading rapidly. Simple mathematics reveals the problem. If casualty rates continue at current levels, the entire division will be combat ineffective within 2 weeks. The division will have taken all its objectives. The airfield is captured. The southern island is secured, but the Umurbrogol ridges remain in Japanese hands, capable of interdicting the airfield with artillery and mortar fire. The mission is incomplete, and the force available to complete it is dissolving. Even Rupertus cannot ignore this. On September 23rd, he quietly reverses his earlier decision and requests that elements of the 81st Infantry Division be committed to Peleliu. The message is carefully worded to avoid the appearance of requesting help. The army troops are being brought in to relieve Marines rather than to reinforce them, a semantic distinction that preserves pride while admitting reality. The 3-day delay between when army help was first offered and when it was accepted costs approximately 500 Marine casualties, men killed or wounded in attacks that might have been avoided if fresh troops were available sooner. This calculation will haunt post-battle analyses and later historical assessments. Could 500 Marines have been saved if Rupertus accepted help on September 20th instead of September 23rd? The answer is unknowable with certainty, but the casualties during those 3 days are a matter of record. The dead don't care about institutional pride or inter-service rivalry. Their families don't care about whether Marines or Army troops took a particular hill. The living Marines who fought during those days, watching friends die in attacks that seemed increasingly futile, certainly care, and many will spend decades wondering whether their sacrifices were necessary or were simply the price of a general's ego. The larger strategic question hanging over Peleliu by late September is whether the entire operation should be terminated. Admiral Halsey, who recommended canceling Peleliu before it started, watches the casualty reports with growing alarm. He knows that MacArthur's Philippines invasion is proceeding ahead of schedule, and that Japanese air power is so degraded that Peleliu's airfield is strategically irrelevant. The original justification for the battle no longer exists. But the machinery of military operations, once set in motion, is almost impossible to stop. Thousands of men are engaged in combat. Hundreds are dead. To call off the operation now would mean admitting that those men died for nothing, a psychological and political impossibility. So the battle continues, not because it's necessary, but because stopping it would require admitting it was never necessary in the first place. This is the logic of institutional momentum, and it will drive Peleliu to its bitter conclusion regardless of strategic relevance. Admiral Chester Nimitz, overall commander of Pacific Forces, receives detailed briefings on Peleliu's progress. He reads casualty reports. He reads assessments from naval commanders. He must have moments of doubt. This operation was planned under his authority, and the catastrophic casualties reflect on his leadership. But Nimitz, like Rupertus, is trapped by decisions already made. He cannot publicly question an operation he personally approved. He cannot withdraw forces engaged in active combat. He cannot admit that his planning was flawed without undermining confidence in his entire command structure. So he issues statements of support, commends the Marines for their courage, and privately wonders what went wrong. In the post-war years, Nimitz will admit candidly that Peleliu's capture was unnecessary for later operations. This admission comes too late for the men who died there. but it at least provides historical clarity. Peleliu was a mistake, recognized as such by the senior commanders who ordered it, but a mistake that could not be stopped once started. The command crisis on Peleliu reveals fundamental problems in American military decision-making that will recur throughout the war and beyond. Senior commanders, under pressure to maintain morale and project confidence, often cannot admit mistakes even when evidence is overwhelming. Institutional rivalries between service branches lead to decisions based on pride rather than tactical reality. The disconnect between headquarters and frontline conditions creates information failures, where senior officers literally don't understand what their troops are experiencing. And the momentum of military operations creates situations where battles continue long after their strategic purpose has evaporated, simply because stopping would require someone in authority to say, "This was wrong, and we're quitting." That admission is so difficult, so potentially career-ending, so corrosive to morale and public confidence, that commanders will often accept hundreds or thousands of unnecessary casualties rather than make it. Peleliu is not the first battle where this happens. It won't be the last, but it's perhaps the clearest example in the Pacific War of how command failures at the strategic level translate into suffering at the tactical level. General Ruppers, sitting in his command tent with a broken ankle and a broken battle plan, cannot find the courage to admit error. So the attacks continue, the casualties mount, and the island that didn't matter claims more lives every day, sacrificed not to military necessity, but to institutional pride and the unwillingness of commanders to acknowledge what frontline Marines already know. This battle is a disaster that should never have been fought. October 1st, 1944, 0900 hours. Private First Class Russell Davis of the 321st Infantry Regiment, 81st Infantry Division, wades ashore on Orange Beach 3, trying not to stare at what Peleliu has done to the Marines. The beach is littered with destroyed equipment, burned-out Amtraks, shattered crates, discarded weapons. But worse is the look on the faces of the Marines. His regiment is replacing. They're hollow-eyed, filthy, moving with the mechanical motions of men who have pushed themselves beyond human limits. One Marine passing Davis's squad on the beach stops and says flatly, "Good luck, dogface, you're gonna need it." The use of dogface Army slang is delivered without particular malice, just exhaustion. Davis, who is 21 years old from Pennsylvania and has never been in combat, watches the Marines shuffle toward evacuation boats and feels his stomach tighten. These are supposed to be the elite troops, the best America has. If Peleliu broke them, what will it do to Army draftees with no combat experience? The 81st Infantry Division arrives on Peleliu under circumstances that are awkward for everyone involved. The division, nicknamed the Wildcats, is composed largely of draftees rather than volunteers, trained in conventional infantry tactics rather than amphibious assault. Their army, which makes them the subject of Marine Corps skepticism. Marines have a professional disdain for Army troops who they consider less aggressive and less capable. The Wildcats, for their part, are acutely aware that they're being brought in to finish a job the Marines started, a situation guaranteed to create resentment on both sides. The 1st Marine Division's leadership makes the handover as smooth as possible, but there's no disguising the reality. The Marines are being relieved because they've been destroyed. The 81st is inheriting a battlefield where American advantages have proven insufficient and where casualties come in quantities that defy pre-war imagination. The Army's introduction to Peleliu begins with a brutal education in terrain. The 321st Regiment is assigned to continue the assault on Bloody Nose Ridge, taking over sectors the Marines can no longer hold. Company A receives orders to assault a position the map designates as Hill 2, one of the 5 sisters. Captain George Hanna briefs his platoon leaders using maps and photographs provided by Marine intelligence, but the materials don't convey the reality. The maps show contour lines and elevations. The photographs show coral ridges and vegetation. What they don't show is that every yard of approach is pre-registered for Japanese mortars, that the coral is sharp enough to cut through boot leather in hours, that the heat will drop men from exhaustion before they're shot, that the caves are deeper and more extensive than anyone imagined. Hanna's company moves out at 1400 hours, advancing toward Hill 2, with the confidence of troops who haven't yet learned to be afraid. They learn quickly. The 1st Army assault on Bloody Nose Ridge costs 230 casualties from the 321st Regiment in 48 hours. The tactics are different from Marine methods. Army doctrine emphasizes slower, more methodical advances, with heavier preparatory fires and more deliberate consolidation of gains. But the terrain and the Japanese defenses care nothing for doctrine. Army troops die trying to climb coral ridges, just as Marines died. Army casualties from heat exhaustion mount just as Marine casualties did. Army wounded scream for medics, just as Marine wounded screamed for corpsmen. The only significant difference is that Army units have more replacement troops available, allowing them to sustain operations longer before being rendered combat ineffective. It's a grim form of efficiency. The Army can afford to lose more men because they have more men to lose. The Five Sisters, 5 coral peaks designated Hills 1 through 5, become the focus of the Army's effort in early October. Each hill is a fortress in miniature, honeycombed with caves and connected by tunnels to adjacent positions. Taking Hill 1 requires a week of sustained combat. Taking Hill 2 requires another week. The pattern is grimly predictable. Artillery pounds the position for hours, doing minimal damage to cave defenses. Infantry advances under cover of smoke and supporting fire. Japanese positions that survived the artillery open fire, inflicting heavy casualties. The Americans push forward anyway, climbing coral slopes under fire, losing men with every yard. They reach the crest, suffer more casualties clearing the position, then defend against counterattacks and infiltration through the night. At dawn, they discover that Japanese troops have reoccupied caves connected to the tunnel system, and the whole process starts over. It's warfare as attrition, a slow grinding where both sides lose, but the Americans can replace losses, and the Japanese cannot. The relationship between Army troops and the Marines they're replacing is complicated by mutual respect and institutional rivalry. The Marines admire the Army's willingness to take on Peleliu's most difficult terrain. The Army respects the Marines for surviving weeks of combat that destroyed regiments, but beneath the surface, tensions simmer. Some Marines resent being rescued by Army troops, feeling it diminishes their accomplishments. Some Army soldiers resent being thrown into a battle the Marines couldn't finish, feeling like they're being used to salvage Marine Corps pride. These tensions rarely erupt into open conflict. Everyone is too busy surviving, but they color interactions. A Marine tank crew supporting an Army rifle company works effectively, but without the easy camaraderie they'd have with Marine infantry. An Army artillery forward observer, coordinating with Marine gunners, does his job professionally, but notes the subtle disdain in how the Marines treat dog-face observers. By mid-October, the 81st Division has learned the same tactical lessons the 1st Marine Division learned, paying the same price in blood for the education. They've discovered that standard flamethrowers are inadequate and have requested mechanized units. They've learned that tanks operate better in pairs or larger groups, with infantry protection rather than individually. They've developed their own cave reduction techniques, similar to, but slightly different from Marine methods. Army engineers prefer larger demolition charges and more aggressive use of bulldozers. Army infantry advances with heavier support weapons, using more machine guns and light mortars than comparable Marine units. These are tactical minutiae, the kind of differences military historians will later analyze and debate. To the men fighting, the differences are survival strategies developed through trial and error, where error means death. The casualties continue to mount at rates that shock even the most pessimistic pre-invasion estimates. By October 15th, the 321st Regiment has suffered approximately 58% casualties, remarkably similar to the 1st Marines' loss rate, suggesting that the Umurbrogol consumes attackers at a constant rate, regardless of which service provides them. Company commanders who started the battle with 160 men now lead 40 or 50. Platoon leaders who commanded 35 soldiers now lead 8 or 10. The Wildcats are being torn apart just as the Marines were torn apart, and for the same reason, the terrain and defenses create a tactical situation where every gain requires disproportionate losses. The Army has more replacements available, so the division doesn't collapse as the Marine Division did, but individual units suffer just as severely. Private Davis, who landed on October 1st with minimal combat experience, is a veteran by October 15th. He's fought in the Five Sisters, helped reduce half a dozen caves, watched friends die in circumstances that still haunt his nightmares. He's learned to tell the difference between incoming and outgoing artillery by sound. He's learned to sleep while mortar shells explode nearby. His body's so exhausted it can't maintain alertness even in danger. He's learned to disconnect emotionally from death. The Marine Corps talks about esprit de corps and unit cohesion, but Davis has discovered that getting too attached to the guys around you just makes it worse when they die. So he keeps to himself, does his job, and waits for the day this island finally falls, or the day he gets hit, whichever comes first. It's not the attitude recruiters promised or propaganda films portrayed, but it's how you survive Peleliu if you survive at all. The broader strategic picture by mid-October reveals the operation's fundamental absurdity. MacArthur has already invaded the Philippines, landing at late on October 20th. His fleet passes well north of Peleliu without suffering air attacks from the supposedly critical airfield. The Japanese air threat that justified this entire operation has evaporated through attrition and fuel shortages. Peleliu's airfield, captured at the cost of thousands of casualties, sits largely unused except for emergency landings and minor air operations. Meanwhile, the battle to reduce the last Japanese positions in the Umurbrogol continues to consume American lives at a steady rate. Men are dying to capture caves that have no strategic value, to secure terrain that doesn't matter, to complete a mission whose original purpose has disappeared. The absurdity is apparent to anyone willing to see it, but the battle continues because institutional momentum, sunk costs, and the inability to admit error drive it forward, regardless of logic or necessity. October 20th, 1944, 1100 hours. Sergeant John McNulty enters the main tunnel system beneath the Umurbrogol ridges, flashlight duct taped to his rifle barrel, breathing through a wet cloth held over his mouth. The air inside the cave is thick with coral dust, the smell of explosives, and something worse, the sweet rot stench of decay that means dead bodies somewhere in the darkness ahead. McNulty is 23 years old, from Boston, and before Peleliu he never imagined fighting underground like a rat in a sewer. Behind him, 3 more Marines move in single file, each man close enough to touch the one ahead, because the darkness beyond their flashlights is absolute and disorienting. The tunnel extends ahead into blackness that seems to swallow light. Water drips from the ceiling, trickling down coral walls. Somewhere ahead, maybe 100 feet, maybe more, Japanese soldiers are waiting. McNulty advances slowly, rifle ready, trying not to think about what happens if they're ambushed in this tunnel, where there's no room to maneuver and nowhere to go. The penetration of Peleliu's cave systems represents the most nightmarish phase of an already nightmarish battle. By late October, American forces control the island's surface, but hundreds of Japanese troops remain underground in a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that defies conventional assault. Some caves are simple, single chambers with one entrance easily sealed. Others are complex beyond belief. Multi-level systems connected by tunnels running hundreds of feet, with alternative entrances, ventilation shafts, and internal rooms for ammunition storage, living quarters, and command functions. Engineers mapping the system discover tunnels connecting positions half a mile apart. They find ventilation systems using bamboo pipes to draw fresh air from shafts hidden in jungle vegetation. They find electric lights powered by generators deep in the coral. What Nakagawa's engineers built over 6 months is not a defensive position, but an underground fortress, and reducing it requires tactics no American military manual describes. The first major penetration of the tunnel system occurs on October 15th, when Marines clearing a cave complex notice artificial light coming from a passage extending deeper into the ridge. Standard procedure is to seal such passages with demolitions, but this particular tunnel is wide enough for men to walk upright, and intelligence officers are desperate to understand the extent of Japanese underground defenses. A volunteer team, 4 Marines and 1 engineer with demolitions, enters the tunnel to explore. They advance 300 feet before encountering a Japanese position, a reinforced chamber with firing ports covering the approach. The engagement happens at close range and near darkness, muzzle flashes providing the only illumination. 2 Marines are killed instantly. The survivors retreat, dragging one body with them, leaving the other where he fell. They emerge with critical intelligence. The caves aren't isolated positions, but a connected system where Japanese troops can move between locations without exposing themselves to surface fire. Fighting inside the caves requires abandoning almost everything American forces are good at. Artillery is useless. You can't call fire support when you're underground. Radios barely function in the coral tunnels, their signals blocked by hundreds of feet of rock. Grenades are dangerous to both sides in confined spaces where fragmentation ricochets unpredictably. Flamethrowers work but consume oxygen in tunnels, potentially suffocating the operators. What remains is the most basic form of combat. Small groups of men with rifles and flashlights, advancing into darkness against enemies who know the terrain intimately and choose when and where to fight. The psychological stress is almost unbearable. Combat veterans who face Japanese charges across open ground without flinching break down in the claustrophobic darkness of cave fighting. The darkness isn't just absence of light. It's oppressive, disorienting, filled with sounds that might be enemy movement, or might be dripping water or shifting rock. Men fire at shadows. They freeze at noises. Some refuse to enter caves at all, and their officers don't force them because sending terrified men into that environment just gets them killed. The engineers develop specialized techniques for underground warfare. They use sound-powered phones, communication systems that don't require electricity to maintain contact with surface commanders. They set up listening posts where they bury geophones in the coral, detecting vibrations from movement or digging underground. They develop new explosive configurations. Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosive pushed into tunnels to clear sections without requiring men to enter. They experiment with pumping smoke into cave systems, trying to force Japanese troops into areas where they can be killed or captured. Some methods work, others fail spectacularly. On October 23rd, engineers pumped tear gas into a cave complex, hoping to flush out defenders. The gas flows through tunnels to an exit port behind American lines, gassing friendly troops instead. 2 soldiers are incapacitated before someone realizes what's happening and calls for gas masks. The discovery of Colonel Nakagawa's command post on November 15th reveals the sophistication of the Japanese defensive system. The command cave, located deep in the central Umurbrogol, is a reinforced concrete bunker positioned inside a natural cave chamber. It has electric lights, ventilation, communications equipment, maps showing the entire defensive layout, and supplies stockpiled for months of resistance. But it's empty, recently abandoned based on warm food found in the chamber. Nakagawa and his staff have withdrawn deeper into the system, refusing to be captured even when the position is hopeless. American intelligence officers photograph everything, collecting documents that will later provide detailed insights into Japanese planning. But the immediate value is psychological. Reaching Nakagawa's command post proves that American forces can penetrate anywhere in the cave system, given enough time and casualties. The question is whether the cost is acceptable. By early November, the cave reduction operations become methodical and terrible. Teams of Marines and Army troops work section by section, mapping the tunnel system, clearing chambers, sealing exits. They develop a vocabulary for what they find: hot caves still occupied by living Japanese troops, cold caves containing only bodies, connected caves linked to the tunnel network, isolated caves with single entrances. Each type requires different tactics. Hot caves are assaulted with the full blowtorch and corkscrew method, suppression, flamethrower attack, demolitions, infantry clearance. Cold caves are checked for booby traps and then sealed. Connected caves are the most dangerous because Japanese troops can evacuate through tunnels and reoccupy later. These require multiple entries, mapping internal layout, and systematic demolition of connections. Some large cave complexes require weeks to fully clear. The human remains discovered in the caves tell stories of the battle's final weeks. In one cave, Marines find 30 Japanese bodies arranged in neat rows, men who committed suicide rather than face capture. In another, they find evidence of a makeshift hospital, bloody bandages, crude surgical instruments, bodies with battlefield injuries that were treated but couldn't be saved. In a third, they find ammunition stores and food supplies that were never used, suggesting the occupants were killed or driven out before they could deplete resources. The most disturbing discoveries are the caves that were sealed with Japanese troops still inside, either by American demolitions that blocked all exits, or by cave collapses from bombardment. How many Japanese soldiers are still entombed in unsealed sections of the tunnel system is unknown. Post-battle, the military makes no serious effort to excavate collapsed caves. The dead are left where they fell, buried in coral tombs that will preserve their bodies for decades. The psychological impact on the Americans conducting cave clearance operations is severe and long-lasting. These are not clean firefights in open terrain. This is close-quarters killing in darkness, often at distances measured in feet rather than yards. Men describe the experience as uniquely horrible, worse than any other combat they experienced because of the claustrophobia, the darkness, the constant uncertainty about what's in the next chamber. Flamethrower operators, who deal with the moral weight of burning people alive, are rotated out of caves frequently to preserve their sanity. Engineers who place demolition charges describe nightmares about being trapped underground when explosives detonate. Infantry who clear chambers room by room talk about the constant fear of ambush, the way every corner might hide an enemy, the knowledge that if you're shot in a tunnel, there's no evacuation, no corpsman, just bleeding to death in the dark while your squad continues forward. By late November, the organized Japanese resistance in the Umurbrogol is collapsing, food supplies are exhausted, water sources are contaminated or destroyed, ammunition is depleted. The tunnel system, which once seemed impregnable, has been penetrated and mapped. Japanese troops who remain alive are isolated in shrinking pockets, cut off from each other and from any hope of relief or escape. But they don't surrender. Surrender is not part of their orders or their culture. So they fight to the end, individual soldiers or small groups making final stands in caves that become their tombs. The Americans continue the grinding work of clearance, paying in casualties for every chamber secured. November 24th marks the last organized Japanese resistance, a pocket of perhaps 70 or 80 troops who fight until they're wiped out. After that, only scattered holdouts remain, individuals or pairs hiding in unexplored cave sections, living on cached supplies, emerging at night to scavenge what they can. These holdouts are hunted for months. Some are killed, a few surrender. Others simply disappear into the coral labyrinth and are never accounted for. The battle beneath Peleliu's surface, fought in darkness and fear, represents a type of warfare that the American military was unprepared for and hoped never to repeat. But the lessons learned will prove essential. The cave fighting tactics developed on Peleliu are immediately applied at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese forces replicate Nakagawa's defensive strategy on even larger scales. The psychological toll of underground combat influences post-war military psychiatry, leading to better understanding of claustrophobia-related trauma and combat stress. The technical innovations, improved flamethrowers, specialized demolitions, cave mapping techniques become part of military doctrine. But these practical benefits come at a cost measured in men who fought in conditions that human beings were never designed to endure. The caves of Peleliu consumed not just lives but souls, breaking something in many men who entered that darkness and emerged changed in ways they could never fully articulate. The island's surface battle was terrible enough. The battle beneath the surface was a descent into a hell that even Dante couldn't have imagined. November 20th, 1944, 2200 hours. In a command cave 200 feet beneath the Umurbrogol ridges, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa sits at a small wooden table, writing his final messages by candlelight. Above him, the battle rages as American forces close in on the last Japanese positions. The sound of explosions penetrates even this deep subsonic thumps that shake coral dust from the ceiling and make the candle flame flicker. Nakagawa is 43 years old, a professional soldier who has fought for his emperor across China and now on this remote coral island that will become his grave. He knows with absolute certainty that he will not survive the night. What he doesn't know, what he cannot know, is whether his defense of Peleliu has accomplished anything meaningful or whether 10,000 men have died here for nothing. He finishes his message to Peleliu headquarters, signs it, and hands it to a radio operator who will transmit it as soon as atmospheric conditions allow. The message is brief: Sakura, Sakura, cherry blossoms, the code for imminent death. Nakagawa's situation by late November is hopeless by any military standard, but hopelessness is precisely what he was ordered to achieve. His instructions from higher command were explicit: hold Peleliu as long as possible, inflict maximum casualties on the Americans, kill 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier lost. By these metrics, Nakagawa has partially succeeded. The battle has lasted over 2 months, instead of the predicted 3 to 4 days. American casualties exceed 10,000 killed and wounded. The ratio falls short of 10 to 1. It's closer to 1.6 Americans killed for every Japanese death, but the strategic impact exceeds simple mathematics. Peleliu has demonstrated that determined defenders in properly prepared positions can bleed American forces white, even when facing overwhelming material superiority. The Americans won Peleliu, technically, but they paid a price that makes victory a hollow word. For Nakagawa, this must provide some cold comfort in his final hours. The endgame of the Japanese defense follows a pattern that repeats across the Pacific: systematic contraction as the Americans advance, conservation of ammunition and supplies, refusal to surrender even when the position becomes untenable. By mid-November, Nakagawa controls perhaps 300 square yards of the central Umurbrogol, a tiny pocket compared to the original defensive zone. He has approximately 300 to 400 soldiers still alive, down from the original garrison of 10,900. Food is nearly exhausted. Water supplies are contaminated or destroyed. Ammunition is critically low. Medical supplies are gone. Wounded men die from infections that simple penicillin would cure. But there is no penicillin, no morphine, nothing but rice wine to dull the pain. The Americans could simply seal the remaining caves and wait for the defenders to starve, but that's not how this war is fought. The Americans want the caves cleared, the enemy destroyed, the islands secured, so they continue attacking, and Nakagawa's dwindling force continues defending. Nakagawa's command style in these final weeks is described in documents recovered after the battle. He maintains rigid discipline, refusing to allow waste of ammunition or supplies. He rotates troops through fighting positions to preserve their strength. He issues orders prohibiting surrender, reminding his men that their duty is to die for the emperor. But beneath the formal military language, there's a human element. Nakagawa knows these men personally. He's lived with them for 8 months, planned defenses with them, watched them fight with courage that deserves better than dying in a coral hole for an island that doesn't matter. He writes letters to families of senior officers who have already fallen, expressing respect and regret. These letters are never mailed. There's no way to get them off the island. But the act of writing them suggests Nakagawa understands the human cost of his defense in ways that pure military duty wouldn't require. November 24th marks the effective end of organized resistance. American forces, using the full combined arms tactics developed over 2 months of trial and error, assault the final Japanese pockets systematically. Tanks with flamethrowers approach cave mouths. Infantry suppresses positions. Engineers place demolitions. One by one, the remaining strong points are reduced. Nakagawa's command cave is attacked at approximately 1500 hours. The assault is methodical and overwhelming. No heroics required, just the systematic application of superior firepower against a position that cannot be resupplied or reinforced. The cave defenses hold for several hours, inflicting casualties on the attackers, but the outcome is inevitable. By nightfall, American troops occupy the outer chambers of the command complex. Nakagawa and his remaining officers withdraw to the deepest chamber, a concrete bunker at the far end of a tunnel. What happens next is reconstructed from Japanese sources and documents found later. Nakagawa orders the regimental colors, the flag that symbolizes his unit's honor and history, burned in a small ritual fire. He cannot allow the flag to be captured. That would dishonor every man who served under it. The silk burns slowly, releasing acrid smoke in the confined space. When the flag is consumed, Nakagawa writes a final message for transmission. "Our sword is broken, and we have run out of spears." The radio operator sends this message, then destroys the radio equipment to prevent capture. Nakagawa then gathers his senior officers, perhaps a dozen men, and performs the ritual that Japanese military culture has prepared him for since officer training. Seppuku, ritual suicide. The ceremony is formal, despite the circumstances. Each officer kneels. Each uses a wakizashi blade, short sword, to cut his own abdomen in the traditional pattern. Death from seppuku is slow and agonizing, unless a second person performs kaishaku, decapitation to end suffering. The junior officers perform this duty for their seniors, then commit seppuku themselves. The last man has no one to grant him this mercy, and presumably dies alone in the darkness. American troops don't discover Nakagawa's body until 1947, during a cave exploration operation conducted by engineers mapping the tunnel system. They find skeletal remains in the deepest chamber of what was once the command cave, along with swords, military insignia, and documents that identify the bodies as senior Japanese officers. Nakagawa's body is identified by personal effects and uniform remnants. He's found in formal sitting position, wakizashi blade beside him, having died according to the code he served his entire adult life. The discovery allows American military intelligence to close the file on Peleliu's defender, a professional soldier who executed his orders with skill and determination, inflicting casualties far beyond what American planners anticipated. Nakagawa's remains are eventually returned to Japan and buried with military honors. The enemy's acknowledgement that professional competence deserves respect, even across the divide of war. The The Japanese garrison's final casualty figures tell the story of Peleliu's brutality in stark numbers. Of approximately 10,900 Japanese troops on the island, only 202 are captured alive, a survival rate of 1.8%. The vast majority of those captured are Korean or Okinawan laborers, who were never trained as combat troops and who lack the ideological commitment to fight to death. Of the actual Japanese military personnel, survival is virtually zero. Some die in combat, others commit suicide. A few become isolated holdouts who survive in caves for months or years, but are eventually killed or captured. The completeness of the Japanese annihilation shocks even American officers accustomed to high enemy casualties in Pacific battles. At Tarawa, roughly 100 Japanese troops were captured out of 4,000 defenders, a survival rate of 2.5%. At Saipan, approximately 900 Japanese survived out of 30,000, 3%. Peleliu's 1.8% sets a grim record that won't be exceeded until Iwo Jima. The question of whether Nakagawa achieved his objectives depends on how you define success. In military terms, he held Peleliu for 74 days instead of 3 to 4 days, a tactical success that inflicted strategic delay on American operations. He killed or wounded over 10,000 Americans, a casualty figure that exceeded all pre-battle estimates and shocked senior commanders. He demonstrated defensive techniques that Japanese forces would replicate at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, buying time for Japan to prepare homeland defenses. By these measures, Nakagawa succeeded brilliantly, but in a larger sense he achieved nothing. Peleliu fell to American control. The airfield, though captured at terrible cost, was never strategically necessary. The Philippines invasion succeeded without needing Peleliu secured. Japan lost 10,000 trained troops and gained nothing except knowledge that prepared defenses could slow but not stop American advances. Nakagawa's success was a success in prolonging inevitable defeat, not preventing it. The larger implications of Nakagawa's defense become clear in the months following Peleliu. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Japanese forces used nearly identical tactics: deep cave defenses, reverse slope positions, no banzai charges, disciplined conservation of ammunition, orders to inflict maximum casualties rather than die gloriously. The result is 26,000 American casualties, including 7,000 dead, the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceed Japanese. At Okinawa in April through June 1945, the pattern repeats on an even larger scale: 12,000 American deaths, 50,000 casualties total, 3 months of grinding combat that destroys entire divisions. These battles validate Nakagawa's approach and terrify American planners contemplating the invasion of Japan itself. If small islands defended by 10 to 20,000 troops can inflict such catastrophic casualties, what will happen when American forces assault the Japanese home islands, defended by millions of troops and millions of armed civilians? The casualty projections from Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, estimate 400,000 to 800,000 American deaths, with Japanese casualties in the millions. These projections, influenced directly by experiences at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, help convince President Truman to authorize the atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Colonel Nakagawa never knew that his defense of a worthless coral island would influence the decision to use nuclear weapons, ending the war he was fighting. He died believing he had done his duty, held his position as long as possible, honored the emperor and his regiment. Whether that honor was worth 10,000 lives, both his own men and the Americans who died attacking them, is a question that transcends military analysis and enters the realm of philosophy and morality. Nakagawa was a professional soldier executing lawful orders from legitimate authority, doing what soldiers have done throughout history, defending territory entrusted to them with all available means. That he did this skillfully and courageously is undeniable. That it was ultimately futile and contributed to horrors he never imagined is equally undeniable. He remains one of history's most effective tactical commanders in defensive warfare, and simultaneously a figure whose effectiveness prolonged a war that was already lost, contributing to casualties that might have been avoided through earlier surrender. His legacy is complex and will remain controversial as long as people study Peleliu and try to extract meaning from its senseless brutality. December 1st, 1944. 0800 hours. Navy Seabee Jim Thompson drives a bulldozer across Peleliu's airfield, pushing aside debris from 2 months of combat. His job is to clear the field for operational use, making the airfield worth the 2,000 American lives it cost to capture. The work should be straightforward: fill craters, remove wreckage, grade the coral surface smooth enough for aircraft operations. But every few yards, Thompson's blade uncovers something that makes his stomach turn. A boot with a foot still in it, buried in shallow coral. Shell casings by the thousands, creating dunes of brass. A marine helmet with a bullet hole through the temple. And bodies or parts of bodies hastily buried in the first chaotic weeks of battle, and now uncovered by bulldozer work. Thompson stops the dozer, radios for a graves registration team, and waits in the morning heat while flies swarm around whatever his blade has exposed. This is his 4th such discovery this morning. The island may be secured according to official reports, but Peleliu remains a graveyard, and clearing it for use means confronting death at every turn. The immediate post-battle cleanup of Peleliu reveals the scale of destruction with nauseating clarity. Over 2 months of sustained combat has turned the island into a toxic waste dump. Thousands of tons of unexploded ordnance lie scattered across the battlefield. Artillery shells that didn't detonate, mortar rounds buried in coral, grenades lost in the chaos of combat, aerial bombs that malfunctioned, Japanese mines that were never triggered. Conservative estimates suggest 40,000 individual pieces of unexploded ordnance, contaminating the island, each one potentially lethal. Clearing them requires explosive ordnance disposal teams to work methodically across every square yard of combat zone, a process that will take months and cost additional lives. On December 9th, 3 Navy engineers are killed when a bulldozer blade strikes a buried Japanese aerial torpedo, detonating over 400 pounds of explosives. The blast creates a crater 30 feet across and can be heard on Angar, 6 miles away. The human remains create an even more distressing problem. American dead were evacuated when possible, but combat conditions didn't always allow proper recovery. Bodies fell in areas that remained under fire for days or weeks. Others were buried in hasty graves that were lost track of as fighting shifted across the island. Graves registration teams, assigned the grim task of recovering and identifying American dead, work through December and into January. They find remains in caves that were sealed with explosives. They find skeletons in coral crevices where wounded men crawled to die alone. They find mass graves where platoons buried their dead during brief lulls in fighting, marking locations with crude crosses that were later destroyed by shell fire. The recovery work is psychologically devastating. These are not fresh bodies but corpses that have decomposed in tropical heat for weeks or months, often beyond recognition. Identification relies on dog tags, dental records, and personal effects. Many bodies cannot be positively identified and are eventually buried as unknown. Japanese dead pose an even larger problem because there are so many more of them and because many are entombed in collapsed caves that can't be safely excavated. The official American policy is to bury enemy dead in mass graves with minimal ceremony, but the sheer number of bodies makes even this difficult. Burial details, composed of Marines and Army troops who drew unlucky duty assignments, spend weeks collecting Japanese remains from battlefields and caves. The work is horrible beyond description. Bodies in advanced decomposition, coral insects swarming over remains, the stench so overwhelming that men vomit behind their gas masks. Some caves containing Japanese dead are simply sealed with explosives rather than cleared. The entrance is collapsed, entombing the bodies permanently inside the coral. How many Japanese soldiers remain buried in unsealed caves is unknown, but post-war Japanese recovery efforts will eventually locate hundreds of remains in cave systems that weren't fully explored during American occupation. The airfield, captured at such terrible cost, proves largely useless for its intended purpose. By December, when it's finally cleared and operational, the strategic situation has changed completely. MacArthur's Philippines campaign is well advanced. Japanese air power in the region is negligible. American bombers based in the Marianas have better range and facilities than anything Peleliu offers. The airfield is used primarily for emergency landings by damaged aircraft and for light transport operations, roles that hardly justify the thousands of casualties incurred to capture it. In March 1945, a Marine bomber squadron deploys to Peleliu as part of routine rotation. The pilots and air crews, arriving 6 months after the battle, look around at the blasted landscape and ask the obvious question: what the hell happened here? The Marines and soldiers who fought for this airfield can only respond with bitter laughter. What happened here was that people died for an objective that never mattered, and now the evidence of that waste is scattered across the island in the form of unexploded shells and unmarked graves. The environmental damage to Peleliu is severe, and in some areas permanent. The coral reef systems that surrounded the island, habitat for thousands of species of marine life, are destroyed by bombardment, fuel contamination, and coral rubble dumped during construction. Reef recovery in tropical environments takes decades under ideal conditions. In areas where fuel and unexploded ordnance contaminate the ocean floor, recovery may take a century or more. The vegetation that covered much of the island is obliterated, trees shredded by shell fragments, soil contaminated with explosives residue, entire hillsides stripped to bare coral by bulldozer operations. Post-war aerial photographs show Peleliu transformed from a jungle-covered island to a lunar landscape of bare rock and craters. Some areas will eventually revegetate naturally. Others remain barren coral decades after the battle. The most persistent danger comes from Japanese holdouts, soldiers who were isolated during the final cave fighting and who continue to survive in unexplored cave sections. The most famous is Lieutenant E. Yamaguchi, who emerges on August 15, 1945, VJ Day, the day Japan formally surrenders from a cave system in the northern Umurbrogol. Yamaguchi has survived for 9 months after the battle's official end, living on cached supplies and water from cave seeps, completely unaware that the war has ended. American occupation forces, alerted by local Palauan civilians who spotted Yamaguchi scavenging, surround his cave and eventually persuade him to surrender by playing recorded messages from Japanese officials announcing the surrender. Yamaguchi is the last confirmed holdout on Peleliu, but persistent rumors circulate for years about others who died in isolated caves without ever knowing the war ended. The human cost of occupying Peleliu continues long after organized combat ends. Between December 1944 and August 1945, American forces suffer 29 additional deaths from accidents, unexploded ordnance, and skirmishes with holdouts. These casualties don't appear in battle statistics. They're recorded under categories like non-hostile deaths or occupation casualties, but they're just as real as combat deaths. A Marine killed by a mine in January 1945 is just as dead as one killed by machine gun fire in September. To the families receiving telegrams about their sons or husbands killed on Peleliu, the distinction between combat and non-combat death is meaningless. The island killed their loved ones, and that's all that matters. The burial and reburial of American dead becomes a complex process that spans years. Initially, American casualties are buried in temporary cemeteries on Peleliu itself, crude grave fields with wooden crosses marking individual plots. The largest cemetery is established near the airfield, with neat rows of graves visible from passing aircraft, a reminder to everyone of what this place cost. But these temporary graves are always intended to be impermanent. In 1947 and 1948, graves registration units begin the process of exhuming remains for reburial in permanent military cemeteries, or return to the United States for burial by families. Of the 1,252 Marines and soldiers initially buried on Peleliu, most are eventually exhumed and moved. Some families request remains be returned home. Others are reburied in the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines or the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii. A few whose remains cannot be recovered or identified remain listed as missing or buried as unknowns. The process is emotionally wrenching for families, but it allows proper memorialization of the dead and closure for those who lost loved ones on an island most people never heard of. By late 1945, with the war over and demobilization underway, Peleliu fades from national consciousness with remarkable speed. The island never captured public imagination the way Iwo Jima or Okinawa did. There are no iconic photographs from Peleliu, no flag raising on Mount Suribachi equivalent. Press coverage during the battle was minimal compared to other Pacific operations. The strategic irrelevance of the island becomes increasingly obvious in hindsight, making it an uncomfortable subject for military public relations. The result is a kind of collective amnesia. Americans who lived through World War II can often recall hearing about D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Far fewer remember Peleliu. The men who fought there return home to find that most people have never heard of the battle. They're thanked for their service, welcomed home as heroes, but their specific experiences remain invisible to a nation that wants to celebrate victory rather than examine its cost. The island itself, captured at such terrible expense, is returned to Palau in 1994 as part of decolonization. Today, it's a quiet tropical island, its beaches popular with divers who come to see coral reefs slowly recovering from wartime destruction. The caves remain, and the bones remain, and the ghosts remain for anyone willing to look. But most visitors just see a beautiful island and never imagine what happened there 75 years ago. December 10, 1944, Washington, D.C., in a secure briefing room at the Pentagon, Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, sits before a classified casualty analysis that should terrify anyone contemplating the invasion of Japan. The report summarizes Peleliu's final statistics: 1,794 Americans killed in action, 8,010 wounded, total casualties 9,804. The island is 6 square miles. Simple division reveals that Americans suffered 1,633 casualties per square mile to capture Peleliu. By comparison, Tarawa, previously considered the costliest battle in Marine Corps history, produced 891 casualties per square mile. Iwo Jima, fought 2 months later, will generate approximately 842 casualties per square mile. Peleliu stands alone as the most casualty-dense operation in the Pacific War. King reads these numbers and thinks about Japan. 145,000 square miles of home islands, defended by millions of troops and millions of armed civilians. If Peleliu's casualty density applied to invading Japan, American losses would exceed 200 million, a number so absurd it reveals the calculation's futility. But even reducing the projection to realistic estimates produces numbers that make King's blood run cold: 400,000 to 800,000 American deaths to conquer Japan through conventional invasion. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of all Pacific forces, issues a classified assessment of Peleliu on December 15th that amounts to a professional admission of error. The memo, distributed only to senior commanders, contains a sentence that will haunt military historians: Peleliu's capture was unnecessary for the support of later operations. Coming from the officer who personally approved the operation, this represents extraordinary candor. Nimitz essentially admits that 2,000 Americans died and 8,000 were wounded for an objective that didn't matter. The memo goes on to analyze what went wrong: intelligence failures that underestimated Japanese defensive preparations, flawed assumptions about the effectiveness of naval bombardment, inadequate appreciation for defensive advantages provided by cave systems and coral terrain. But the analysis, however honest, comes too late for the men who died believing their sacrifice served strategic necessity. Nimitz will carry this burden for the rest of his life, occasionally discussing Peleliu in post-war interviews with a visible sadness that suggests he understands the personal cost of command decisions. The strategic calculations happening in Washington during December 1944 are influenced directly by Peleliu's lessons. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are planning Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, scheduled for November 1945. The plan calls for 2 phases: Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu in November, and Operation Coronet, the invasion of Honshu in March 1946. Casualty estimates for these operations are based partly on historical data from previous Pacific battles, but Peleliu changes the calculation dramatically. If Japanese forces on the home islands adopt Nakagawa's defensive tactics, deep fortifications, reverse slope positions, refusal to surrender on a massive scale, American casualties could be catastrophic. The planners look at Peleliu's casualty density, Iwo Jima's casualty rate, and Okinawa's emerging bloodbath, and they produce estimates that range from conservative 400,000 casualties, 150,000 deaths, to pessimistic 1 million casualties, 400,000 deaths. These numbers influence every subsequent decision about how to end the war. The comparison between Peleliu and other Pacific battles reveals disturbing patterns. Tarawa, fought in November 1943, cost 1,696 American casualties, including 1,009 Americans killed. Approximately 23% casualty rate over 3 days of fighting. Military commanders were shocked by Tarawa's losses and vowed to avoid similar bloodbaths. Yet Peleliu, fought 11 months later with all the tactical improvements supposedly learned from Tarawa, produces a 40% casualty rate over 74 days, far worse by every metric. Iwo Jima, fought February through March 1945, will cost 26,000 casualties, including 7,000 dead, a 42% casualty rate, roughly equivalent to Peleliu. Okinawa, April through June 1945, will produce over 50,000 American casualties, including 12,000 dead. The trend is clear and terrifying. As Japanese defenders adopt more sophisticated tactics, American casualties increase despite overwhelming material superiority. Victory is assured. America's industrial capacity and manpower ensure that, but the cost of victory is rising exponentially. The economic analysis of Peleliu is equally damning. The operation cost approximately $267 million in 1944 dollars, equivalent to roughly $4.2 billion in 2024 dollars, adjusting for inflation. This includes naval support, ammunition expenditure, equipment losses, and the cost of treating wounded personnel. Breaking this down by territory captured produces a figure of approximately $5 million per acre in modern terms, making Peleliu the most expensive real estate in military history. What did America receive for this expenditure? An airfield that was never strategically necessary and was barely used, terrain that provided no tactical advantage for subsequent operations, intelligence about Japanese cave defensive tactics that was valuable but could have been obtained through reconnaissance and intelligence analysis rather than frontal assault. When corporate executives make $5 billion investments that produce no return, they're fired and possibly prosecuted. When military commanders make equivalent decisions, they receive medals and promotions. The asymmetry troubles some observers, but not enough to change how military operations are evaluated. The Medal of Honor statistics from Peleliu tell their own story about the battle's intensity and cost. 8 Medals of Honor are awarded for actions on Peleliu, 5 posthumously, 3 to living recipients. This represents approximately 1 Medal of Honor for every 1,200 men who landed, the highest density per combatant of any Pacific battle except Iwo Jima. Captain Everett Pope receives the medal for holding Hill 100, with 9 men against overwhelming attack. Private First Class Arthur Jackson receives it for destroying 12 pillboxes, single-handedly, over 2 days of combat. Private First Class Charles Howard receives it posthumously for smothering a grenade to save his squad. Each medal represents extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. But the sheer number of Medals of Honor awarded, requiring actions above and beyond the call of duty, suggests that Peleliu demanded superhuman effort as a baseline. When ordinary competence isn't sufficient and only exceptional heroism achieves objectives, the mission is arguably beyond what should be asked of troops. The long-term medical costs of Peleliu extend decades beyond the battle. The initial casualty figures, 1,794 killed, 8,010 wounded, don't account for the thousands who develop chronic conditions from their injuries. Chloral-contaminated wounds produce infections that recur for years, requiring repeated surgeries and long-term antibiotic treatment. Heat injuries cause kidney damage that manifests as renal failure decades later. Psychological trauma produces what will later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, requiring lifetime treatment for many veterans. A study conducted in the 1970s tracks Peleliu veterans and discovers that their average lifespan is approximately 10 years shorter than comparable World War II veterans who didn't fight on Peleliu. The excess mortality comes from multiple sources: suicide rates significantly higher than baseline, alcohol-related deaths, complications from untreated combat injuries. The Government Accountability Office estimates that long-term medical costs for Peleliu veterans exceed $1 billion in lifetime care, 4 times the immediate cost of the operation itself. The strategic legacy of Peleliu is paradoxical. The battle was unnecessary, but profoundly influential. It proved that prepared defenses in favorable terrain could inflict unacceptable casualties even against overwhelming American superiority. This lesson was immediately applied by Japanese forces at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, resulting in tens of thousands of additional American casualties. But the same lesson also convinced American planners that invading Japan would be prohibitively costly, accelerating development and deployment of atomic weapons as an alternative to invasion. In this sense, Peleliu contributed to ending the war, not by capturing strategically important terrain, but by demonstrating that conventional invasion of Japan would produce casualties the American public wouldn't tolerate. The 2,000 Americans who died on Peleliu didn't know their sacrifice would influence the decision to use nuclear weapons. They thought they were capturing an airfield. The actual strategic impact of their deaths was to make invasion of Japan unthinkable, ultimately saving hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides by encouraging alternative war-ending strategies. The accountability question, who bears responsibility for Peleliu's unnecessary casualties, is never satisfactorily answered. General Rupertus, who commanded the 1st Marine Division, dies of a heart attack in March 1945, just 6 months after the battle. Some who knew him believe the stress of Peleliu contributed to his death. He never faces official inquiry about his decisions, though his refusal to accept army reinforcements is quietly criticized in classified after-action reports. Admiral Nimitz acknowledges in his post-war assessment that the operation shouldn't have been executed, but he faces no professional consequences. He's too senior, too successful, too essential to Pacific strategy. The institutional military has no mechanism for punishing commanders whose operations succeed tactically but fail strategically. Peleliu was captured. Objectives were taken. By the military's internal logic, the operation was successful. That it cost far more than it should have, that the objectives weren't worth the cost, that better intelligence or decision-making could have avoided the whole disaster. These considerations exist in after-action reports and historical analysis, but don't translate to accountability in any meaningful sense. The broader lesson that military establishments struggle to learn is that tactical success doesn't equal strategic wisdom. Peleliu was a tactical success. American forces captured the island and destroyed the Japanese garrison. It was also a strategic failure. The island wasn't necessary, the costs were excessive, and the operation provided no significant advantage for subsequent campaigns. Military culture celebrates tactical excellence and battlefield courage, making it difficult to acknowledge that brave men died achieving objectives that didn't matter. The Medal of Honor recipients from Peleliu earned their decorations through genuine heroism, but their heroism was in service of a mission that shouldn't have been assigned. This cognitive dissonance, honoring the soldiers while questioning the operation, is difficult for military institutions to process. It's easier to celebrate victory than to examine whether victory was worth its cost. So Peleliu fades from official memory, its lessons learned in classified reports, but its larger failures quietly buried alongside the men who died there. November 15, 1945, Mobile, Alabama. Eugene Sledge steps off a train into the arms of his parents, home from the Pacific after 16 months of combat. He is 21 years old, weighs 40 pounds less than when he enlisted, and looks decades older than his actual age. His mother hugs him and feels him stiffen. Physical contact still triggers defensive reflexes developed in combat. His father asks about the war, and Sledge changes the subject. They drive home through familiar streets that feel alien, past neighbors who wave and smile, past churches and schools, and ordinary life that seems to exist in a different universe from the one Sledge inhabited for the past year. That night at dinner, his mother serves steak, the same meal he ate before boarding ships for Peleliu. Sledge takes one bite and excuses himself to vomit in the bathroom. The smell of cooking meat reminds him too much of burning bodies. He doesn't eat steak again for 30 years. The psychological wounds carried home by Peleliu survivors are severe and largely unrecognized by 1945 medical understanding. The military has concepts of combat fatigue and shell shock, but these are considered temporary conditions that resolve with rest. What Peleliu veterans experience is more profound and permanent. Captain Everett Pope, awarded the Medal of Honor for his defense of Hill 100, attends the White House ceremony in March 1946 to receive his medal from President Truman. The ceremony should be the highlight of his military career. Instead, Pope later describes it as hollow, going through motions that seem meaningless compared to watching his company destroyed. He accepts the medal, poses for photographs, gives appropriate responses to congratulations. Then he goes back to his hotel room and drinks himself unconscious, starting a pattern that will plague him for years. The 1st Marine Division holds its first post-war reunion in San Diego in September 1946. Attendance is lower than expected. Many veterans can't face returning to Marine Corps culture and seeing the men who shared Peleliu with them. Those who attend describe the experience as simultaneously necessary and devastating. Necessary because only other Peleliu veterans understand what they experienced. Devastating because seeing each other triggers memories they've been trying to suppress. The reunions develop a pattern. Heavy drinking starts early in the day. Conversations begin with catching up on civilian life, but inevitably drift to the battle. Stories get told and retold. Who died where? Which ridge was worst? What happened in specific caves? As alcohol flows, some men break down crying. Others become angry, refighting arguments about tactics or leadership. A few leave early, unable to handle the psychological pressure. The reunions continue annually, but attendance declines each year, as veterans find it easier to avoid reminders than to confront them. The Veterans Administration hospitals in the late 1940s are overwhelmed with psychiatric cases from World War II, and Peleliu veterans are disproportionately represented. A VA psychiatrist in San Diego, treating multiple Peleliu veterans, notes in a 1948 clinical paper that their trauma profile differs significantly from European theater veterans. The European combat veterans report nightmares about artillery and German attacks, but generally respond well to therapy and time. The Peleliu veterans report more severe symptoms: intrusive memories triggered by specific stimuli, the smell of burning, the sound of dripping water, enclosed spaces, hypervigilance that never resolves, survivor guilt so profound it borders on suicidal ideation. The psychiatrist concludes that Peleliu's combination of extreme heat, claustrophobic terrain, and prolonged high-intensity combat produce psychological injuries more severe than typical combat exposure. But this insight leads nowhere. The VA has limited resources, psychiatric treatment is primitive by modern standards, and most Peleliu veterans simply suffer in silence rather than seek help that isn't effective anyway. The conspiracy of silence around Peleliu begins almost immediately after the war ends. Media coverage during the battle was minimal. Peleliu was always considered a secondary operation compared to MacArthur's Philippines campaign, which received the bulk of press attention. Post-war, when Americans wanted to celebrate victory and look forward to peace, Peleliu's story of unnecessary casualties and strategic failure didn't fit the narrative. Movies about World War II focused on D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, battles with clear strategic importance and dramatic visuals. Peleliu offered neither. No iconic photographs existed. The airfield that was captured proved useless. The casualties were horrific, but achieved nothing memorable. So Peleliu disappeared from popular culture. A survey conducted in 1953 asks Americans to name significant World War II battles. 92% can name D-Day. 78% can name Iwo Jima. 11% can name Peleliu. The men who fought there returned to a nation that has already forgotten their sacrifice. Eugene Sledge copes with his Peleliu experience through writing, but the process takes 3 decades to complete. He begins writing notes in 1946, trying to record what happened before memory fades. But the writing triggers such severe psychological distress, nightmares, anxiety attacks, depression, that he stops repeatedly. He works on the manuscript sporadically through the 50s and 60s, making progress during stable periods, abandoning it during crises. The book, with the old breed at Peleliu and Okinawa, isn't published until 1981. By then, Sledge is in his 50s, a retired professor, far enough from the events to write about them without completely falling apart. The book becomes recognized as one of the finest combat memoirs ever written, praised for its honesty and psychological insight. But its publication 36 years after the battle speaks to how long it took Sledge to process his experiences sufficiently to share them publicly. The disability claims filed by Peleliu veterans reveal the long-term physical toll. By 1955, over 2,000 Peleliu veterans have received disability ratings for physical injuries sustained on the island. The most common claims involve chronic infections from coral-contaminated wounds, requiring ongoing medical treatment. Others claim hearing loss from artillery exposure, joint damage from climbing coral ridges, heat-related kidney damage. But psychological injuries are rarely recognized. PTSD won't be officially acknowledged as a diagnosis until 1980, 35 years after Peleliu. Veterans suffering from nightmares, hypervigilance, depression, and anxiety are told these are character weaknesses rather than service-connected disabilities. Some are advised to toughen up or stop dwelling on the past. The lack of recognition and treatment contributes to substance abuse, failed marriages, inability to hold employment, and suicide rates significantly higher than baseline populations. The suicide statistics among Peleliu veterans are fragmentary. The VA doesn't track suicide by specific battle until the 1970s, but suggestive patterns emerge in limited studies. A 1972 study tracks 100 Peleliu veterans for 25 years post-war, and finds that 8 have committed suicide, versus an expected baseline of approximately 2 based on general population rates. That's a 400% increase in suicide risk. The mechanisms vary. Some veterans drink themselves to death slowly, a form of suicide that doesn't appear in statistics. Others use firearms, often their service weapons that they kept as souvenirs. A few simply walk into traffic or off buildings, leaving no notes or explanations. The common thread is an inability to reconcile civilian life with wartime experiences, a sense that they survived when better men died, and a belief that they left something essential to their humanity in those coral ridges and can never reclaim it. The alcoholism rates among Peleliu veterans are similarly elevated. A comprehensive study published in 1987 examines health records for 500 Peleliu veterans and finds that 42% have been treated for alcohol-related problems at some point in the 3 decades following the war. This compares to approximately 24% for World War II veterans generally and 18% for the general male population. Alcohol becomes a coping mechanism, the only tool available to many veterans for managing intrusive memories and emotional pain. Some function as high-functioning alcoholics, maintaining jobs and families while drinking heavily every evening. Others descend into obvious alcoholism, losing employment, marriages, and eventually homes. The VA treats the alcohol problem but rarely addresses the underlying trauma driving it. Telling combat veterans to just stop drinking, without treating the PTSD that makes them drink, is futile, but this insight won't become standard practice until decades after it could have helped the Peleliu generation. By the 1970s and 80s, as Peleliu survivors enter late middle age, a final accounting becomes possible. Approximately 9,000 Marines and Army troops landed on Peleliu. Of these, roughly 6,500 survived to 1975. Studies tracking this population find significantly elevated rates of nearly every negative health outcome: cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, chronic pain conditions, psychiatric disorders, substance abuse, divorce, unemployment, homelessness. The phrase Peleliu syndrome appears in some VA medical literature, an unofficial term for the cluster of physical and psychological problems affecting veterans disproportionately. The syndrome isn't officially recognized because the VA has difficulty proving causation. How do you definitively link a heart attack in 1978 to combat stress in 1944? But clinicians working with these veterans recognize patterns that transcend coincidence. Peleliu broke something in many of its survivors, something that never fully healed, manifesting decades later in bodies worn out prematurely and minds that never found peace. The contrast between official recognition and lived experience is stark. Officially, Peleliu was a successful operation. Objectives captured, enemy destroyed, mission accomplished. Veterans receive honorable discharges, campaign ribbons, the GI Bill benefits that help millions of World War II veterans build prosperous post-war lives. Publicly, they're honored as heroes, part of the greatest generation that saved the world from fascism. But privately, in VA hospitals and AA meetings and divorce courts and bankruptcy proceedings, the reality is darker. Many Peleliu veterans struggle for decades with invisible wounds that nobody acknowledges and few understand. They watch movies about Iwo Jima and D-Day and wonder why their battle is forgotten. They attend Memorial Day ceremonies and hear speeches about sacrifice and freedom and wonder if anyone knows what those words actually cost. They grow old carrying memories of friends who died 75 years ago, memories so vivid they're more real than the present moment, and one by one they die, some peacefully in old age, some broken by the physical and psychological toll of what they endured. By 2020, fewer than 10 confirmed Peleliu veterans remain alive. By 2025, perhaps none. And when the last survivor dies, the living memory of Peleliu dies with him, leaving only histories and memorials that can never fully capture what it meant to fight on that coral island for objectives that didn't matter. February 6, 1945. Aboard USS El Dorado, steaming toward Iwo Jima, Marine commanders huddle over intelligence reports and tactical analyses, preparing for an invasion scheduled to begin in 13 days. Every officer in the room has read the classified Peleliu after-action reports. They've studied the cave warfare tactics. They've reviewed the casualty statistics. And they're terrified, because reconnaissance photographs of Iwo Jima show terrain eerily similar to Peleliu's Umurbrogol, volcanic rock ridges, honeycombed with caves, prepared defensive positions on reverse slopes, a landscape designed by nature and improved by Japanese engineers to maximize American casualties. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the invasion force, taps the Peleliu report with his finger and says flatly, "We know what's waiting for us. The question is whether we've learned enough to avoid Peleliu's mistakes. The answer, bought at the cost of 7,000 American dead on Iwo Jima, will be, partially. The immediate tactical lessons from Peleliu are incorporated into Marine Corps doctrine with remarkable speed. The Fleet Marine Force issues updated cave warfare manuals in December 1944, codifying the blowtorch and corkscrew methodology developed on Peleliu. The manuals specify equipment requirements: armored bulldozers for approach routes, flamethrower tanks for cave reduction, increased demolitions for sealing positions, improved coordination between tanks and infantry. Pre-invasion bombardment protocols are completely overhauled. Duration is tripled for Iwo Jima compared to Peleliu, with emphasis on sustained fire rather than maximum intensity. Intelligence procedures are reformed, with aerial reconnaissance supplemented by submarine-based observation and analysis of defensive construction patterns. Every lesson is written in marine blood from Peleliu, and every lesson is applied at Iwo Jima with mixed results. American casualties on Iwo Jima are actually higher than Peleliu in absolute numbers, 26,000 versus 9,800, but lower as a percentage of forces engaged and lower per day of combat. The lessons helped, but not enough. The equipment evolution sparked by Peleliu transforms American infantry capabilities across the Pacific. Portable flamethrowers, which proved inadequate at Peleliu, are supplemented and then largely replaced by mechanized systems with greater range and fuel capacity. The M22 mechanized flamethrower, rushed into production after Peleliu, becomes standard equipment for cave reduction operations. It can throw a stream of burning fuel over 150 yards and carry enough fuel for sustained operations. Armored bulldozers, improvised on Peleliu, are manufactured and issued as standard equipment. By Iwo Jima, every Marine Engineer Battalion includes armored dozers in their table of organization. Demolitions are scaled up dramatically. Where Peleliu used 50-pound charges as standard, Iwo Jima operations routinely employ 500-pound charges. Specialized shaped charges designed for cave entrances are developed and fielded. The procurement and logistics system that moves from Peleliu's improvisations to Iwo Jima's standardized equipment represents organizational learning at its most effective, though it comes too late for the men who died learning these lessons the hard way. The intelligence reforms triggered by Peleliu's failures have lasting impact on American military practice. The fundamental error at Peleliu, assuming aerial reconnaissance alone could identify defensive preparations, leads to multi-source intelligence fusion becoming standard. Pre-invasion planning for Iwo Jima includes submarine periscope photography, signals intelligence monitoring Japanese communications, interrogation of prisoners from previous battles, and analysis of construction materials shipped to target islands. The intelligence assessment for Iwo Jima is far more accurate than Peleliu's. Planners correctly estimate approximately 21,000 defenders and identify the existence of extensive cave systems. They're still wrong about specific details, and men still die from intelligence failures, but the overall picture is dramatically better than the near-total blindness American commanders operated under at Peleliu. This intelligence methodology becomes standard practice, influencing American military operations through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The strategic lessons from Peleliu are more ambiguous and more controversial. At the highest levels, Peleliu proves that securing every island between American bases and Japan is unnecessary. You can bypass fortified positions and isolate them rather than assaulting them directly. This island-hopping strategy, already in use before Peleliu, is validated by Peleliu's strategic irrelevance. The Philippines invasion succeeds without needing Peleliu secured. MacArthur's forces bypass numerous Japanese-held islands, leaving their garrisons to wither on the vine without supplies or reinforcements. Had this strategy been applied to Peleliu, thousands of lives would have been saved. But the lesson isn't fully learned. Iwo Jima and Okinawa are still assaulted directly, despite being bypassed strategically, because their airfields are deemed necessary for the invasion of Japan. Whether these operations were truly necessary remains debated among historians, but Peleliu at least establishes that strategic necessity should be rigorously examined before committing troops to amphibious assault. The casualty tolerance question raised by Peleliu influences American strategy for the remainder of the war and beyond. Peleliu's 40% casualty rate, combined with similar rates at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, convinces planners that invading Japan will produce catastrophic losses. The estimates for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, range from 400,000 to 800,000 American casualties, with some projections exceeding 1 million. These numbers influence President Truman's decision to authorize atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Truman later writes that the bombs saved 500,000 American lives, a figure derived directly from casualty projections based on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa experiences. Whether the atomic bombs were necessary or justified is beyond military analysis and enters moral philosophy. But the casualty projections that influenced their use came from battles like Peleliu. In this indirect way, Peleliu's unnecessary casualties contributed to ending the war through demonstrating that conventional invasion was unacceptable. The doctrinal impact of Peleliu extends beyond World War II into subsequent conflicts. The cave warfare techniques developed on Peleliu are applied in Korea when American forces assault fortified hilltop positions defended by Chinese and North Korean troops. The tactics work: armored support, flamethrowers, coordinated infantry assault, but the casualties remain high. In Vietnam, when American forces encounter Viet Cong tunnel systems, they draw on Peleliu's lessons. Never enter tunnels without reconnaissance, use specialized tunnel rats rather than standard infantry, employ demolitions to collapse systems rather than clearing them room by room. The parallels aren't exact. Vietnam's tunnels differ from Peleliu's caves, but the conceptual framework comes from Peleliu. Even in Afghanistan and Iraq, when American forces assault cave complexes used by Taliban or insurgent forces, the tactics trace lineage to Peleliu. Reconnaissance, precision weapons to seal entrances, infantry only as last resort. The lessons purchased with Marine blood in 1944 remain relevant 8 decades later. The question of whether Peleliu's lessons justify its cost is fundamentally unanswerable because it depends on counterfactual reasoning. If Peleliu hadn't been fought, would Americans have learned cave warfare tactics somewhere else? Probably, though possibly at even higher cost, if the first encounter with prepared cave defenses came at Iwo Jima or Okinawa, rather than smaller-scale Peleliu. Did Peleliu's casualties convince American leadership to end the war through atomic weapons rather than invasion? Possibly, though other factors, Japanese refusal to surrender, Soviet entry into the Pacific War, desire to end the war before more American lives were lost, also influenced the decision. Did the tactical innovations developed at Peleliu save lives at subsequent battles? Certainly, though quantifying how many lives is impossible. The uncomfortable truth is that military organizations learn primarily through failure and bloodshed, and Peleliu was a costly classroom that taught valuable lessons, but whether those lessons could have been learned differently and at lower cost remains forever unknown. The institutional memory of Peleliu within the Marine Corps is complex and somewhat contradictory. On one hand, Peleliu validates the Marine Corps' role as elite assault troops capable of achieving objectives conventional forces cannot. The 1st Marine Division destroyed a heavily fortified position against determined resistance, demonstrating courage and tactical skill. On the other hand, Peleliu exposes command failures, intelligence breakdowns, and the human cost of institutional pride that refuse to accept help when needed. Marine Corps schools study Peleliu as both a tactical success and a cautionary tale. Officer candidates learn about Peleliu's cave warfare innovations, while also learning about Rupertus's failures in judgment. The battle exists in Marine Corps culture as simultaneously a source of pride and shame. Pride in the individual Marines who fought with extraordinary courage, shame that they were asked to fight for objectives that didn't matter. The broader American military's relationship with Peleliu is one of selective amnesia. Peleliu doesn't fit comfortably in narratives about World War II. It wasn't a decisive battle like Midway. It wasn't a dramatic victory like D-Day. It wasn't a heroic last stand like the Philippines. It was a grinding, costly operation that achieved negligible strategic results, and that's not a story military institutions enjoy telling. So Peleliu appears in military histories and professional journals, studied by officers for tactical lessons, but it remains largely absent from popular military culture. There are no major monuments to Peleliu on the National Mall, No Hollywood blockbusters feature the battle. Veterans Day speeches rarely mention it. The battle exists in the professional military consciousness as a case study in what to avoid, while being largely erased from public memory as an uncomfortable reminder that not all sacrifices in war are strategically meaningful. The men who fought there deserve better, but institutional memory is selective, preferring inspiring victories to expensive mistakes, even when both deserve recognition. March 3, 1946, a congressional hearing room in Washington. Representative Claire Hoffman of Michigan questions Marine Corps Commandant Alexander Vandegrift about Peleliu's casualty rates. Hoffman holds a statistical analysis prepared by his staff, and the numbers have made him angry. General, Hoffman says, reading from the document, Peleliu is 6 square miles. American casualties were 9,804. That's 1,633 casualties per square mile. Can you explain to this committee why American forces needed to suffer such disproportionate losses for such minimal territorial gain? Vandegrift, who commanded the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal and understands combat casualties better than any politician, responds carefully. Representative, we don't measure military success in square miles. We measure it in objectives achieved and enemy destroyed. Hoffman isn't satisfied. The objective was an airfield that was barely used. The enemy destroyed numbered approximately 11,000, at a cost of nearly 10,000 American casualties. That's almost 1-to-1 exchange ratio against an enemy who couldn't be reinforced or resupplied. Explain to these taxpayers why that represents success. Vandegrift has no good answer, and the hearing moves on, but the question hangs in the air. When do the numbers reveal not military necessity, but command failure? The statistical analysis of Peleliu reveals patterns that are difficult to explain or justify. The time-to-casualty ratio, how quickly troops become casualties, is among the worst in American military history. The average Marine on Peleliu became a casualty after 16.8 days of combat exposure. For comparison, Marines at Guadalcanal averaged 43 days before becoming casualties. Soldiers in Europe averaged 62 days. The rapid attrition rate on Peleliu reflects both the intensity of combat and the inability to rotate troops out of dangerous positions. Men fought continuously in frontline positions until they were killed, wounded, or completely exhausted. There were no safe areas, no rear positions where troops could recover. The entire island was a combat zone, and every day increased the probability of becoming a casualty until it approached mathematical certainty. The unit destruction statistics are even more disturbing. Of the rifle companies that landed on Peleliu, 64% suffered over 50% casualties. Organizational devastation that renders units combat ineffective. Company C, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, Captain Pope's company, suffered 96% casualties including killed, wounded, and evacuated for heat exhaustion. The company effectively ceased to exist as a functioning organization. Company 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, suffered 71% casualties. Across the division, entire platoons were wiped out. Of the roughly 45 rifle platoons in the 1st Marine Regiment, 37 suffered casualties exceeding 50%. This level of destruction exceeds anything in Marine Corps history except possibly Tarawa, and it occurred over 74 days rather than 3, suggesting sustained attrition rather than a single catastrophic engagement. The long-term medical consequences produce casualty statistics that extend decades beyond the battle. Of the 8,010 Marines and soldiers officially recorded as wounded on Peleliu, approximately 41% require ongoing medical care for more than 5 years post-war. 18% are permanently disabled and receive lifetime disability benefits. The most common long-term injuries are coral infection-related complications, hearing loss from artillery exposure, orthopedic damage from climbing coral ridges, and heat-related kidney damage. But these physical injuries don't account for psychological casualties. PTSD isn't officially recognized until 1980, so most Peleliu veterans with psychological injuries never receive service-connected disability ratings. If psychological casualties were counted using modern diagnostic criteria and applied retroactively, total Peleliu casualties would likely exceed 12,000, representing over 50% of everyone who landed on the island, becoming a casualty in some form. The economic cost analysis reveals expenditures that seem almost fraudulent in retrospect. The operation cost $267 million in direct expenses, ammunition, naval fuel, equipment losses, evacuation, and medical treatment costs. This doesn't include long-term costs, like lifetime disability payments, VA medical care, or pension benefits for widows and dependents. When these are factored in, total lifetime cost for Peleliu approaches $1 billion. The return on this investment is an airfield that was never strategically necessary and was barely used operationally. If Peleliu were a corporate investment, it would represent one of the worst resource allocations in history, billions spent for negligible return. But military operations aren't evaluated like business investments, and the human cost of mistakes is borne by soldiers and their families rather than shareholders and executives. The Medal of Honor density at Peleliu, 8 awards for approximately 9,000 troops, represents 1 medal per 1,125 participants. This can be interpreted 2 ways. Optimistically, it reflects extraordinary courage and heroism by Marines facing impossible odds. Pessimistically, it suggests that normal courage and competence were insufficient on Peleliu, and only exceptional actions achieved what should have been routine objectives. When you need superhuman effort to accomplish missions, the missions are arguably beyond what should be assigned. The posthumous awards, 5 of the 8 Medals of Honor, are particularly revealing. These recognize actions where individuals sacrifice their lives to save comrades or achieve objectives. That over 60% of Peleliu's Medals of Honor are posthumous suggests a battlefield where survival and mission accomplishment were often mutually exclusive choices. The comparative casualty analysis places Peleliu in perspective against other Pacific battles. Guadalcanal, the Marines' first major offensive, cost approximately 7,000 American casualties over 6 months, comparable to Peleliu's 2.5-month battle in absolute numbers, but far lower in casualty rate. Tarawa cost 1,700 casualties in 3 days, horrific intensity but brief duration. Iwo Jima cost 26,000 casualties over 5 weeks, higher total but comparable percentage to Peleliu. Okinawa cost 50,000 casualties over 10 weeks, the highest absolute losses but lowest daily casualty rate because of the extended time frame. By any metric, total casualties, casualty rate, casualties per square mile, time to casualty ratio, Peleliu ranks among the most costly American battles in the Pacific. The only significant difference is that Iwo Jima and Okinawa can at least claim strategic importance as bases for Japan invasion. Peleliu cannot. The kill ratio analysis, Americans killed per Japanese killed, reveals asymmetries that should trouble strategic planners. Americans killed approximately 10,900 Japanese troops at the cost of 1,794 American deaths, a ratio of roughly 6 Japanese killed for every American. That sounds favorable until you consider the context. The Japanese couldn't be reinforced or resupplied. They had limited ammunition and food. They were defending a tiny island against overwhelming firepower. Under these conditions, kill ratios should be far more favorable to Americans, perhaps 20 or 30 to 1, as achieved at some other Pacific battles. The relatively unfavorable ratio suggests that American advantages in firepower, air support, and numbers were largely negated by Japanese defensive tactics and terrain advantages. This is precisely what worries planners contemplating invasion of Japan. If isolated, surrounded Japanese forces achieve kill ratios of 6 to 1 in their favor on the defense, what will happen when defending their homeland with unlimited supplies and reinforcements? The actuarial analysis of Peleliu veterans, comparing their life expectancy to other World War II veterans, reveals excess mortality that constitutes delayed casualties. A comprehensive study tracking Peleliu veterans finds their average lifespan is approximately 10 years shorter than matched World War II veterans who didn't fight on Peleliu. The excess mortality comes from multiple causes: higher rates of cardiovascular disease, likely from heat damage, kidney failure from dehydration and heat injury, cancer from chemical exposure, and suicide from PTSD. If these excess deaths are counted as Peleliu-related casualties, the true death toll from the battle approaches 3,000 rather than the official 1,794. The island killed men in 1944 and continued killing them slowly for decades afterward. The final accounting of Peleliu requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how military success is defined and measured. By traditional metrics, Peleliu was successful: objectives captured, enemy destroyed, American forces victorious. But by any rational cost-benefit analysis, Peleliu was a disaster: excessive casualties for negligible strategic gain, tactical methods that proved inadequate, intelligence failures, that resulted in avoidable losses, command decisions driven by institutional pride rather than military necessity. The cognitive dissonance between these two assessments, tactical success and strategic failure, is difficult to resolve. Military culture emphasizes completing assigned missions regardless of cost, which makes it institutionally difficult to acknowledge that some missions shouldn't be assigned. So Peleliu exists in official memory as a hard-fought victory, while existing in historical analysis as an avoidable mistake. The men who died there deserve recognition for their courage and sacrifice. They also deserve acknowledgement that their sacrifices were demanded by flawed strategic planning and sustained by institutional momentum that valued completion over cost. Both truths can coexist, and both should inform how we remember Peleliu and how we evaluate military operations that demand extraordinary sacrifice for questionable gain. September 15, 1994. Peleliu, Republic of Palau. 50 years to the day after the invasion began, elderly American veterans walk across the same beaches where they landed as young men. Eugene Sledge is here, 70 years old now, accompanied by his wife and son. Captain Everett Pope, now 74, walks slowly using a cane, not from combat injuries but from age and the weight of memory. They are among approximately 300 Peleliu veterans who have returned for this 50th anniversary commemoration. The beach where they land is quiet now, tropical and beautiful, coral sand white in the morning sun. No destroyed Amtraks, no bodies, no shell craters. Nature has reclaimed most of what war destroyed, covering the scars with vegetation and new coral growth. But the veterans don't see beauty, they see ghosts. Every yard of this beach is populated by memories of men who fell here, and the veterans move through a landscape more crowded with the past than the present. The commemoration ceremony takes place at a memorial erected on Peleliu in the 1980s, a modest stone monument listing the names of Americans killed in the battle. The names cover 4 large marble panels, 1,794 names, representing 1,794 families who received telegrams, 1,794 futures erased. The ceremony includes speeches from American and Japanese officials honoring sacrifice on both sides. A Japanese veteran, one of perhaps a dozen survivors from the original 11,000-man garrison, speaks about Colonel Nakagawa's leadership and the defense of Peleliu. His speech is translated, and the American veterans listen respectfully. The gulf between enemies has softened over 50 years. These old men no longer see each other as threats, but as fellow survivors of a shared horror that transcends national boundaries. After the official ceremony, Sledge asks his family to accompany him to a specific location on the island. He's brought maps and photographs, trying to orient himself to a landscape that has changed dramatically. The airfield is still there. Palau uses it for small aircraft, but everything else is different. The ridges that were blasted bare in 1944 are now covered with jungle vegetation. The cave mouths that dominated his nightmares are overgrown or collapsed. The position where his mortar squad fought is impossible to locate. Every landmark has changed or disappeared. Sledge stands in what he believes is approximately the right location, and begins speaking to his son about what happened here. He talks for nearly an hour, describing combat in detail he's never shared before. His son listens, overwhelmed by the contrast between this peaceful jungle and the hell his father describes. When Sledge finishes, he stands silently for several minutes, and his wife notices tears running down his face. 50 years haven't made it easier to remember. They've only made it clearer how much was lost. The Japanese commemoration of Peleliu differs significantly from American remembrance. In Japan, Peleliu is recognized as one of the war's great defensive battles, where Japanese forces inflicted disproportionate casualties on superior American forces through skill and determination. Colonel Nakagawa is honored as a hero who executed his orders perfectly, holding far longer than expected and killing far more Americans than predicted. The Japanese government maintains a memorial on Peleliu, a larger, more prominent monument than the American one, honoring the approximately 10,900 Japanese soldiers who died defending the island. Japanese veterans groups organize regular pilgrimages to Peleliu, searching for remains of fallen comrades and conducting Buddhist ceremonies for the dead. The contrast with American amnesia is striking. Japan remembers and honors its Peleliu dead, while America largely forgets. The search for remains continues decades after the battle. The Palauan government periodically grants permission for Japanese recovery teams to excavate caves and search for bodies of soldiers still unaccounted for. These operations find remains regularly, skeletons in caves that were sealed in 1944, burial sites that were never properly documented, individual soldiers who died in isolated locations and were never found. Each discovery allows families in Japan to conduct proper funeral rites for soldiers who died 50 or 60 years earlier. The American equivalent, searching for missing Marines and soldiers, is less systematic. Some families hire private search teams to look for specific individuals. Others petition the Defense POWEB/MIA accounting agency for assistance. But the resources devoted to Peleliu searches are minimal compared to other conflicts, reflecting the battle's low priority in American consciousness. By 2004, at the 60th anniversary commemoration, attendance by American veterans has dropped dramatically. Only about 50 veterans make the trip. Most are in their 80s, many in poor health, some accompanied by family members or caregivers. The ceremony is smaller, less publicized, attended mostly by Palauans, who remember the battle as the defining event of their island's history. The aging veterans walk the old battlefields more slowly now, some in wheelchairs, all aware this is probably their final visit. Dick Higgins, a machine gunner from Company K, stands at the beach and tells a reporter, "We were used up and thrown away. Nobody remembers, nobody cares." The bitterness in his voice reflects not just Peleliu's obscurity, but the larger sense among veterans that their specific sacrifices have been erased from national memory. While World War II generally is celebrated in abstract terms that erase the details of individual battles and deaths, the educational gap about Peleliu is documented in a 2010 study of American high school history textbooks. Researchers examined 20 popular textbooks covering World War II and find that only 3 mention Peleliu at all. Of those 3, one devotes a single sentence to the battle, another includes it in a list of Pacific operations without detail, and the third provides a paragraph of basic facts. By comparison, Iwo Jima appears in all 20 textbooks, often with multiple paragraphs or even full pages of coverage. D-Day receives similar extensive treatment. The educational system has essentially erased Peleliu from the standard narrative of World War II, ensuring that future generations won't know the battle happened unless they specifically research it. The veterans who fought there return home to find that their children's history classes don't mention Peleliu. Their grandchildren have never heard of it. The battle has passed from living memory into historical obscurity within a single lifetime. The last confirmed Peleliu veteran dies on August 27, 2019. Dick Higgins, the machine gunner who survived Company K's decimation, passes away at age 94 in a VA hospital in Southern California. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times runs 6 paragraphs, mentions his World War II service, notes he fought at Peleliu, but doesn't elaborate on what that meant. The newspaper's readers, if they notice the obituary at all, likely don't recognize Peleliu as significant. With Higgins's death, the direct link to Peleliu is broken. No one remains who landed on those beaches, climbed those ridges, fought in those caves. The battle passes from living memory into history, joining Antietam and Gettysburg and the Somme as events that exist only in books and documents and the imagination of historians trying to reconstruct what happened. The physical legacy of Peleliu persists long after the last veteran dies. The island itself remains contaminated with unexploded ordnance. Estimates suggest thousands of shells, grenades, and mines still scattered across the landscape. Signs warn visitors away from certain areas. Every few years, someone, usually a local civilian or a tourist, is injured or killed by ordnance that has waited 75 years to complete its mission of destruction. The caves remain, though most are sealed or collapsed. A few are maintained as historical sites, allowing visitors to walk a short distance inside and imagine what cave warfare was like. The imagination inevitably falls short. You can't recreate in daylight tourism the horror of fighting in darkness with death waiting in every shadow. The airfield still operates, used by small aircraft for inter-island flights. The passengers flying in and out rarely know that the runway beneath them cost 2,000 American lives and 10,000 Japanese lives, or that it was never necessary in the first place. The moral reckoning with Peleliu remains unfinished and perhaps unfinishable. How do we honor the courage and sacrifice of men who died there, while acknowledging that their deaths served no strategic purpose? How do we celebrate their heroism without validating the flawed decisions that put them in that position? How do we remember without either glorifying war or dishonoring sacrifice? These questions have no clear answers, and different people approach them differently. Veterans tend to focus on individual acts of courage and unit cohesion, the specific moments when men saved each other's lives or died trying. Historians tend to focus on strategic failures and command decisions, the systemic errors that made the battle unnecessarily costly. Families focus on personal loss, the specific individual who died and what that death meant to those left behind. All these perspectives are valid, and all struggle to extract meaning from a battle that seems to resist easy interpretation. The ultimate question hanging over Peleliu is what obligations we have to those who fought and died there. We owe them honesty, acknowledging that their battle was strategically unnecessary, rather than pretending it was vital to victory. We owe them remembrance, ensuring their sacrifices are not completely forgotten, even if they're not widely celebrated. We owe them justice, holding accountable the systems and decisions that demanded their lives for inadequate reasons. We owe them learning, extracting lessons that might prevent future Pelelius, future battles where men die, achieving objectives that don't matter. Whether we've fulfilled these obligations is debatable. The battle is largely forgotten. Accountability was never achieved. The lessons are written in classified reports, but not internalized in military culture. What remains is a small coral island in the Pacific, its beaches and ridges gradually returning to nature, its caves still hiding bones, and its story surviving in a handful of books and a dwindling number of people who care to remember. When the last person who remembers Peleliu dies, not the last veteran, but the last family member, or historian, or even casual reader who knows the battle happened, Peleliu will still exist, the island will still sit in the Pacific, the caves will still be there, the bones will still be there, but the connection between that geography and the human suffering that occurred there will be broken. Peleliu will become just another island, its history a footnote available to anyone curious enough to search but invisible to those who aren't. Perhaps that's the final lesson of Peleliu, that even enormous human sacrifices can be forgotten, that battles fought with courage and paid for in blood can disappear from memory, that the great wars we think will be remembered forever are actually remembered selectively, preserving the stories that comfort us and erasing the ones that don't. The men who died on Peleliu deserve better than obscurity. They deserve a nation that remembers what was asked of them and what they gave. They deserve honesty about whether their sacrifices were necessary. They deserve a final accounting that acknowledges both their courage and the failures that required that courage. They deserve not to be forgotten, but as the last voices fade and the last memories dim, forgetting is exactly what's happening. The island keeps its secrets, and the ghosts walk beaches that tourists will swim from tomorrow, invisible to everyone who wasn't there, crying out to a world that has moved on and doesn't hear them anymore.